Good morning. I'm Commissioner Steve Bowman of the Marine Resources Commission. I'd like to call the July 28, 2020 meeting of the Marine Resources Commission to order. At the present time, I'll call the roll to determine if we have a quorum. Members of the Commission, please answer when your name is called. Mr. France. Mr. France?
Can you hear me?
We have you now, sir. Have you here. Thank you. Mr. Tankard?
Here.
Mr. Zedrin?
Here.
Thank you. Dr. Neal?
Here.
Mr. Ballard is absent due to a well-deserved vacation. Mr. Minor? Mr. Minor? Ms. Lusk?
She is here but not connected to audio. I'll talk to her.
Ms. Lusk, we have you on the line, but we do not have you connected to audio. We will come back to you. Ms. Everett? Ms. Lusk?
I'm here.
Thank you. Ms. Everett? Ms. Everett?
Here.
Thank you. Chair is present. Let the record reflect we do have a quorum. At the present time, I'd like to ask Mr. Ed Tankard to provide the invocation. Mr. Tankard?
Lord, let us pray. As Representative John Lewis lies in state at our nation's capital, keep us in mindful of the American ideals for which he stood. All Americans have a voice, and our government must treat us all equally. Given the social unrest in our country, we ask that you give us the wisdom to take into account all the opinions and facts presented here today. Finally, in the heat of summer, we ask that you look after our brave Marine police. We surely know that they will be called on to serve the public in the cases of extreme weather or accidental events. For this we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mr. Tankard. Ladies and gentlemen, you've had a chance to review the agenda for today's meeting. Are there any corrections, additions, or deletions to the agenda by members of the commission or staff? There seeing none, the chair will entertain a motion.
I, John Zedrin, move to approve the agenda as presented.
Motion made by Mr. Zedrin to approve the agenda as presented. Is there a second?
So moved, Ed Tankard.
Motion made by Mr. Tankard, or second by Mr. Tankard. Further discussion? I will call the roll. Mr. France? Mr. France?
Aye. Mr. France is aye.
Thank you. Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin?
Aye.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Ballard is absent. Mr. Minor?
Aye. Aye.
Thank you. Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett? Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Thank you. Chair votes aye. Please mute your telephone if you're not speaking at this time. Thank you. The next item on the agenda are the minutes. You had an opportunity to review the minutes. Are there any additions, corrections, or deletions to the minutes by members of the commission or staff? If not, the chair will entertain a motion.
I, John Zedrin, move to approve the minutes as presented.
Is there a second to the motion?
James Minor, second.
Thank you, Mr. Minor. Mr. France?
Abstain.
Mr. Tankard,
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin, Mr. Zedrin,
Aye.
thank you. Dr. Neal,
Aye.
Mr. Minor,
Aye.
Ms. Lusk,
Aye.
Ms. Everett,
Aye.
chair votes aye. Thank you. At this time, we have permits, projects over $500,000 with no objection and with staff recommendation for approval. Mr. Watkinson,
Yes, sir, Mr. Commissioner and associate members. These are those projects, as you say, that are over $500,000 in project value. They've been subjected to our standard public interest review. We don't have any objections, and staff is recommending approval.
all right.
With that,
Mr. Watkinson, before you go any further, do you solemnly swear the testimony that you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
yes, sir, I do.
Thank you. Please proceed.
All right, the first item on our page 2 list of 5 is our Hold Company LLC. Request authorization to replace an existing 5-foot wide by 70-foot long tending pier and replace existing floating piers consisting of 60 wet slips at Rivers Rest Marina. That's at 9100 Wilcox Neck Road along the Chickahominy River in Charles City County. In this case, staff recommends approval with an encroachment royalty in the amount of $200 for the encroachment of the tending pier over 200 square feet of subaqueous bottom at a rate of $1 per square foot. Item 2B, Joint Base Langley Eustis, request authorization to construct approximately 590 linear feet of steel sheet pile bulkhead, no more than 2 feet channelward of an existing failing bulkhead, and replace existing finger pier piles as necessary at the third port facility on Fort Eustis, adjacent to Skiff's Creek in the city of Newport News. Item 2C, Army Corps of Engineers is requesting authorization to place approximately 110,000 cubic yards of sandy dredge material per dredge cycle from the maintenance dredging of the Chincoteague Inlet Federal Navigation Channel within the previously used overboard placement site located in the Atlantic Ocean southwest of Chincoteague Inlet in Accomack County. The placement site is centered at 37 degrees, 50.6514 minutes north latitude and 75 degrees, 27.058 minutes west longitude. Item 2D, Huntington Ingalls Incorporated, Newport News Shipbuilding. Request authorization to add a 336-foot by 84-foot open pile mooring standoff platform and a new mooring dolphin system to Pier 3 at Newport News Shipbuilding along the James River in the city of Newport News. And lastly, item 2E, City of Hampton, request authorization to construct 261 linear feet of replacement bulkhead, 230 linear feet of 10-foot wide wharf, and 70 linear feet of 4-foot wide wharf at the end of South King Street along the Hampton River in the city of Hampton. We'll be happy to try and answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions by members of the commission for Mr. Watkinson on any of the items?
Commissioner, I have a question, Ed Tanker.
Mr. Tankard, proceed, please.
Mr. Watkinson, elaborate on why we're not taking the sand from the inlet there at Chincoteague and putting it on wallops. It seems as though we had just done some beach renourishment there, and they may need some more.
Yes, Mr. Tanker, this has been the subject of much discussion and much debate. We've asked the Corps to consider that along with wallops, providing the area for the sand placement. But at this time, the dredge that is used by the Corps is a small hopper dredge that doesn't have the capability of pumping to the beach. And so their equipment that would normally do this dredging could not accomplish that. In addition, when they dredge, they don't always do the 110,000 cubic yards. It's oftentimes just small amounts at various shoals that might appear in the inlet. And if they were to, the Corps were to, in this case, get a larger dredge in there that could pump ashore, the cost of the project would go up millions of dollars at this time. So at this point, it's just not feasible. But I would like to say that I would hope the Corps and Wallops can, at some point in the future, maybe utilize that material if the logistics and the machinery and equipment could be available to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Watkins. It does seem a bit, in a way, for a layman like me, a bit of a waste of a resource in a way.
Mr. Tankard, to that point, and you're not just a layman, this drew the attention of myself and also the Secretary of Natural Resources, Strickler. We formulated a conference call with the Corps to discuss this matter to ensure that all avenues were pursued in an effort to achieve what you are describing, and even the Secretary has made it known, as Mr. Watkinson had alluded to, that we have the distinct desire to not waste this sand and put it to beneficial use on Wallop. So, in all due respect, sir, you may be considering yourself a layman, but your opinion and your concern is not an isolated one. So that's a good catch. Any further questions on these items? This is a public hearing. Does anyone in the public wish to be heard on any of these matters, for or against?
Please tell them to type it into the chat box if they do.
And if you do, please write into the chat box so the host can identify you. There being none, the matter is before the commission.
I, Ed Tankard, move to approve page 2 items.
Thank you, Mr. Tankard. Is there a second?
Second, James Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Minor. Further discussion? Mr. France? Mr. France? Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Mr. Tankard?
Okay.
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin? Mr. Zedrin?
Aye.
Thank you. Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Thank you. Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Mr. Watkinson, do we have anything for the for consent agenda items?
No, sir, we do not.
Thank you very much. Counsel for the commission, Ms. Block, is there any need for a closed meeting for consultation with you or briefing by counsel?
There is not, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Next item on the agenda is Trevor A. Green, item number 20-0363. Who will be handling this?
Mike Johnson, environmental engineer.
Thank you. Mike, Mr. Johnson, solemnly swear the testimony that you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Proceed, please.
Trevor Green, 20-0363, review of the Gloucester County Wetland Board's June 10th, 2020 decision to approve the filling of 500 square feet of vegetated wetlands and 25 square feet of non-vegetated wetlands as part of a bulkhead replacement project along Sarah's Creek at tax map number 51CC111. Since this is a review of the Gloucester Wetland Board decision, I will be presenting the official record of the hearing. This includes the application, presentation by county staff, additional testimony given by staff, the applicant agent, and other testimony provided by the public during the hearing. I will also provide you a summary of the board's deliberations to help them derive the rationale for the decision and why we are reviewing the decision today. You can advance to the next slide. The following slideshow was presented to the board by county staff to help familiarize the board with the issues of the project. This includes aerial photography, application drawings, and photos of the project site. Next slide, please. I did insert this one slide for the commission's benefit to better understand the location of the project site, Sarah's Creek, which is a tributary to the York River near Gloucester Point, and this is just downstream of the Coleman Route 17 bridge. You can see that area highlighted in yellow. Next slide, please. This is a tax map parcel screenshot taken from the Gloucester GIS system. As you can see, the project area is on a finger of Sarah's Creek, marked by the arrow in red. This area does have a bit of history. It has been dredged at least one time before in the 1940s, I believe. The portion where the applicant's property is located is considered to be a natural waterway and state-owned bottom. But once you make that turn up to the northwest, that is considered to be a man-made canal as it was dredged from uplands and wetlands. Next slide. The following 5 slides are a time series of aerial photography that was presented to the board. This first photo is from 2011. The applicant's property is highlighted in blue. As you can see, the applicant's property is undeveloped, as well as the downstream neighbor up to your left a little bit. These pictures will change orientation a little bit as I go through them, so I hope that doesn't confuse you too much. The upstream neighbor to the bottom of the picture does have a residence, pier, and a rock revetment protecting the shoreline as of 2011. Next slide, please. This is another 2011 aerial, just from a different angle, so you can better see the rock revetment on the neighbor's property upstream. And again, you can see that the property is undeveloped here, and also as well the property downstream. Next slide. This is a 2013 aerial showing no real change to the property from 2011 to 2013. Next slide, please. Now this is 2017. As you can see now, the downstream property has been developed. This includes a residence, a marginal wharf or pier, and a bulkhead. And this was approved by the local wetlands board for the bulkhead. Next slide. 2017 from another angle. This helps you better see the established wetlands, vegetated wetlands at the site, the marsh fringe there along the waterway. And this aerial photograph is still representative of site conditions today. Next slide. This table of impacts was presented to the board. This is from the joint permit application. This is showing the project would result in the fill of 500 square feet of vegetated wetlands, 25 square feet of non-vegetated wetlands, and 210 feet of subaqueous bottom. This last portion requires a subaqueous permit from VMRC, but that issue is not being considered by you at this time. Next slide. This is a project plan drawing showing the 105-foot proposed bulkhead with return walls and the location of the intertidal wetlands that are proposed to be filled. Next slide. Thanks. This is a cross-sectional drawing of the proposed bulkhead. The drawing indicates the new bulkhead would be installed 2 feet channelward of an existing failing bulkhead. The new bulkhead would be relocated in state waters and would require a VMRC subaqueous permit. The water depth offshore the bulkhead is approximately 3 feet. This does factor into the decision of the wetland board for a living shoreline not being appropriate for erosion control. And the existing bulkhead is currently protecting a bench vegetated marsh and is essentially functioning as a living shoreline. This is an important consideration I will be coming back to during the staff recommendation. Next slide. This is a ground shot taken at what is approximately low at mid-tide. You can see the bulkhead is in an advanced state of failure with slumping of the marsh through the gaps of the existing bulkhead. The photo also shows there are species of wetlands plants such as saltbush, Spartina alterniflora, Spartina patens, and disticus, and these qualify this as a vegetated wetlands as defined in Title 28.2, Chapter 13 of the Model Wetland Ordinance. Next slide. Now we're going to do some ground shots from different angles. You can see here the wetlands in relation to the neighboring property. Next slide. This is a closer shot showing the marsh area again and the yard that leads up to it. Next slide. Ground shot showing the width of the bench marsh looking upstream. Next slide. Another shot that shows the failing state of the existing bulkhead. This is a zoom into the bench marsh area showing some of the species present that I listed a few moments ago. Looking downstream at the fringe marsh shoreline. And a ground shot of the failing bulkhead close to low tide. As you can see, the new bulkhead would be in VMRC jurisdiction and require the subaqueous permit mentioned before. The bulkhead is in pretty bad shape, and if the bulkhead were to completely fail, the marsh would slump into the creek and result in upland erosion as well. This concluded the slide presentation by county staff to the board. During the public hearing, the board heard testimony from Mrs. Carla Havens, agent for the project. Her comments mentioned the need for the project and the unsuitability of a living shoreline solution for erosion control due to water depths offshore of the bulkhead. She also discussed wetland impact avoidance by installing the bulkhead landward of the wetlands, but says this was dismissed by the applicant as it would still allow the applicants to erode as the bulkhead continues to fail. She then asked the board to approve the project since a similar project was approved a few years ago at this location for a different property owner and that the required on-site mitigation had been completed. All of her comments to the board can be read in the official verbatim minutes, which are part of the packets provided to you. The board also heard comments of the adjacent property owner, Mr. Bowditch. He stated that the board should go ahead and approve the project as both adjoining properties have had their shorelines hardened and a similar project was approved here in 2016. The applicant also made a statement asking the board to approve the project as submitted, saying he wants to protect his property. The slide you have here is a synopsis of the board deliberation, and I'll briefly go over these points. During the deliberations, the board did discuss the need for the project and noted the slumping of tidal marshlands where the bulkhead is in advanced state of failure. They also discussed a living shoreline alternative and decided that offshore bathymetry of -3 feet mean low water at the edge of the existing bulkhead precluded the construction of a rock sill. They discussed avoidance by constructing a bulkhead landward of the local wetland board jurisdictional limits, and they decided that this would still result in loss of the wetlands due to unnatural state of a bench marsh behind the existing failing bulkhead and the dredging history of the creek. The board also noted that a similar project was approved on this property under JPA number 16-1764 that allowed for the construction of a bulkhead and fill of tidal wetlands with creation of wetlands as mitigation, and that the neighbors had also hardened their shorelines. The board decided the best way to preserve the vegetated wetlands for this application was to allow the fill of the 500 square feet of vegetated wetlands and 25 square feet of non-vegetated wetlands and require in lieu mitigation fees to be collected for the creation of a tidal wetlands at another location in the county. You can get to the next slide. These are basically the cliff notes for the staff summary. I will go ahead and read the full staff summary recommendation into the record for you. Section 28.2-1313 of the Code of Virginia specifies when the Commission should modify, remand, or reverse a wetland board's decision. Based upon our attendance at the hearing and our review of the record, staff believes that the Gloucester Wetlands Board erred in its approval of the project as submitted and did not give full consideration to the criteria for approval of an application as specified in the Wetland Zoning Ordinance. It is staff's opinion that the board's rationale for the approval of the project has deviated from established guidelines or guidance by saying that the filling of vegetated wetlands is appropriate for erosion control where the wetlands would be lost due to erosion. This is essentially creating more upland land for the private property owner by filling wetlands and paying a fee, which is not the intent of the Wetlands Zoning Ordinance. Section 28.2-1302-10B of the Wetland Zoning Ordinance states the board shall grant the permit if all the following criteria are met. 1, the anticipated public and private benefit of the proposed activity exceeds its anticipated public and private detriment. 2, the proposed development conforms with the standards prescribed in 28.2-1308 of the Code of Virginia and guidelines promulgated pursuant to 28.2-1301 of the Code of Virginia. And 3, the proposed activity does not violate the purposes and intent of this ordinance or Chapter 13 of Title 28.2 of the Code of Virginia. Section 28.2-1302-10C further states that if the board finds that any of the criteria listed in subsection B of this section are not met, the board shall deny the permit application, but allow the applicant to resubmit the application in modified form. Staff is of the opinion that the board's decision on this matter fails to meet all 3 criteria in subsection B. Additionally, staff thinks the board did not consider all the alternatives that would avoid the filling of the wetlands. There's at least one option that staff discussed with the agent where a new bulkhead could be installed, but at a lower elevation with no backfill that would continue to support the wetlands, maintain continuity within the creek, and protect them and the uplands from erosion. This would essentially create a living shoreline, which is currently the policy of the Commonwealth and preferred alternative for addressing shoreline erosion pursuant to 28.2-104.1 of the Code of Virginia. Section 28.2-1313 of the Code instructs the Commission to modify, remand, or reverse the decision of the Wetlands Board if the Board, in reaching its decision, failed to fulfill its responsibilities under the Wetland Zoning Ordinance. As such, staff recommends that the June 10th, 2020 decision of the Gloucester Wetlands Board be reversed, and the application to fill 500 square feet of vegetated wetlands and 25 square feet of non-vegetated wetlands be denied. This is based on the aforementioned staff findings and the faulty rationale for filling the marsh when there were other methods to address shoreline erosion without converting tidal wetlands to uplands. As stated, this denial does not prevent the applicant from reapplying in modified form to address his erosion control needs. I will note that the chairman for the board, John Sprouse, is online, as well as the agent, Carla Havens, for the project. And I'll be glad to answer any questions you have at this time.
Any questions for Mr. Johnson by members of the commission?
I have a question.
Mr. Tankard?
In the deliberations, I did not see any real mention or some type of quantification of the erosion that they talked about. Certainly the photographs don't show what one might think of as erosion.
So you do note that there are gaps in the bulkhead itself. We are starting to see slumping of that marsh, not too much yet, but the bulkhead is very old and it is failing. And we are starting to see that slumping. As that bulkhead continues to fail, and this is part of the discussion was, as the bulkhead continues to fail, you'll see more slumping of that marsh, and eventually that, because of that 3-foot drop off from the bulkhead offshore, you'll start to see upland erosion as well when that marsh finally disappears.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Johnson, so that I understand, if it stays in the present condition and is not hardened, when the slumping occurs, what we're trying to protect will ultimately be destroyed. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. So if we do nothing, the marsh will be lost eventually when that bulkhead fails because of that perched nature 3 feet above the bottom that you have there. It will disappear at some point in the future if nothing is done. So the board, when they discussed this project, they talked about, a living shoreline that couldn't be done with a rock sill offshore. They didn't discuss the bulkhead behind the vegetated wetlands that would protect the owner's uplands, but still allow the wetlands over time to disappear when that original bulkhead failed.
Okay. Further questions by members of the commission? All right, thank you. Who wishes to be heard from the county at the present time?
Now we'd like to hear from first. We have the agent and the chairman. For number 5?
Well, I have listed here Ron Owens, John Sprouse, and Carla Havens in that order. Mr. Owens, do you wish to be heard?
Mr. Owens is the local wetland board planner. I don't think he'll have too much to add at this point, and I think he was actually having trouble logging in this morning, but I know Mr. Sprouse, I saw him earlier in the attendee list, as well as Miss Carla Havens, the agent.
Okay, I think it'd be appropriate to hear from Mr. Sprouse
I will unmute him.
from the Wetlands Board. Mr. Sprouse?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. There's a significant echo.
Hold on.
Hold on just a second. We're having a little. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We still have an echo that we're trying to work out.
Yeah, hold on just a second. Now.
I think it's technical problems on my end.
We have you loud and clear now, Browskies.
Great.
You solemnly swear the testimony give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Okay, proceed.
I just want to point out a few things. This was the board's first virtual meeting, and Mr. Green's application was the first application on the meeting, and you can see it went rather long. So I think all those added to the complexities of the issue. The board did hear that the previous owner of the property had established the 500 square foot of wetlands that was approved under the 2016 application. But we indicated that that was a different application and did not take that into account. Let me just, I'm trying to collect my thoughts.
Take your time, sir.
Because it was the first, because it was the first virtual meeting, there was some confusion. I know for myself, the facts that I know today, I would not have voted for the application. There was a number of just miscommunications that occurred during the event.
Well, Mr.
I
Sprouse,
personally did not. Go ahead.
Mr. Sprouse, considering that, I still have an echo. Can you mute your cell phone while I talk? Let's try it now.
Go ahead.
Considering what you're saying and the difficulties that you had, out of the gate, while I can't make a motion, I think that everybody deserves a fair and complete hearing. And if there were difficulties that precluded that hearing to be conducted pursuant to the established laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia, there is provision within the code to remand this matter back to the Wetlands Board so that y'all can work out any technical difficulties that you had. The fact that you have indicated that you voted one way, but then had you known something else, causes me grave concern as far as the position the Marine Resources Commission has put in as far as making a determination. So I guess I would ask you, are you asking or would you request that this matter be remanded? Not that the decision has been made for it to be remanded, because I have not heard from all parties involved, but as chairman, is that what you're asking?
Yes, I think we would like the opportunity to review this in more detail at our next meeting.
All right, sir, please mute your phone and I will continue this hearing. Next person wishes to be heard is Ms. Havens. Ms. Havens, are you on?
Let me find her. I do not see her in the attendee list, so what I'm going to do is have to unmute all of the phones.
Okay.
So hold on just a moment.
Ms. Havens, we do not have you in the attendees list, but if you are on, if you wish to speak at this time, please proceed.
Mr. Commissioner, can you hear
Yes,
me?
ma'am, we have you. Yes, ma'am.
I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. Proceed, please.
I'm at a loss for what Mr. Sprouse has just said about the board's decision. I thought it was a pretty clear hearing and decision at the Wetlands Board hearing. That's one of the reasons why it took so long. And yes, there were technical difficulties, but there was quite a bit of discussion. Just to be clear, we did discuss in length alternate locations for the bulkhead. And I say that because when Mike was giving his presentation, I wasn't quite clear if he said it was or was not considered to construct the bulkhead on the landward side of the Spartina, on the landward side of the salt marsh, and it was. And then that would be considered a retaining wall, which would kick it into the Bay Act as opposed to a wetland project. Mr. Green was not interested in constructing a retaining wall and a bulkhead. And that's why we figured going with the bulkhead no more than 2-foot channelward of what had been previously approved, and considering that the mitigation was already completed for the previous property owner, the resource has already been compensated for. And in fact, it's down at the end of the peninsula, so it's even in the same watershed as the green proposed bulkhead. I honestly feel this is a reasonable request, and hopefully you all read through my comments from the hearing. This previously was a marina. The material that is behind the bulkhead now that supports the salt marsh was all dredge material that was excavated from the creek, used as backfill, and there used to be a swimming pool on the property, and all of that was removed when the marina closed down and it was turned into a housing development. So it's not a natural site. It's sort of a wetland that just popped up over time, and the adjacent property owner to the left basically did the exact same thing that Mr. Green would like to do now. It's just that he did it a year or two earlier, and Mr. Green's coming along now and doing it. The permit originally, I said that it was in the Bowditch name, but it's not, and I don't remember the gentleman's name that it was in. He either is or was the sheriff for Gloucester County. I don't live in Gloucester County, so I don't remember his name. But the permit transferred when Mr. Green purchased the property, and unfortunately it expired, and it was extended, and then it was about to expire, and Mr. Green was trying to get a particular contractor to do the work and was just kind of strung along. And bottom line is the permit expired and the bulkhead was not installed. So that's why it went back before the Wetlands Board. Mr. Green was asking for nothing more than what had already been approved in 2017. And again, not to beat a dead horse, but the mitigation has already been completed. And I mean, that's the great order in which to have things when requiring mitigation, I believe. That's pretty much it. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Can you please go back and explain to me that you're saying that the permit to do this had been approved and expired, and it caused I guess a de novo hearing before the Wetlands Board?
The previous permit was number 2016-1764.
Right.
And in my notes here, I said it was in the name of David Bowditch, but it wasn't. And perhaps Mike Johnson has that at his fingertips, the name in which the permit was issued. But that gentleman sold the lot to Mr. Green. and that gentleman did not do any of the bulkhead work. So the wetland permit transferred to Mr. Green. Mr. Green tried to get this contractor, a particular contractor that he had. It's my understanding he had a contract with this marine contractor and was strung along that, yeah, I'm going to get to it, I'm going to get to it, I'm going to get to it, and he didn't. So they extended the bulkhead permit once, they being the Wetlands Board. And I believe it was to expire in December of 2019. And Mr. Green thought that they were at least going to get started on it so that the permit would be valid. But the contractor, for whatever reason, didn't start it. The permit expired, and so that's why we applied under Mr. Green's name for the exact same thing that had been approved of on the 2016-1764 application. And the Wetlands Board approved it then with the mitigation. The mitigation has been completed. It's not on the exact adjacent parcel, but it's down at the end of the parcel, at the end of the little peninsula there. And so what went before the Wetlands Board for review was exactly the same thing that they had approved of in 2017. And at that time, VMRC did not review it. And it's my understanding that there's been no change in county ordinance, state law, legislation. I mean, nothing has changed. And I know July 1 came and went, but this was heard before July 1. And we did consider living shorelines. It's just that site is so adulterated with the bulkheading and the backfilling and the dredging, and nothing is natural out there. And it, as Mike pointed out, it's not suitable for a living shoreline in that there's no way you can get a gentle slope, let alone a 10-to-1 slope out there to either re-establish the marsh or just keep that marsh.
Okay. Ms. Smythe, can you do me a favor and put back up on the screen the frontal picture that shows the property in question with the two adjoining properties so that I can see it from a front angle? No? Yes, that's fine. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Ms. Havens. Do members of the commission have any question for Ms. Havens, agent for Mr. Green?
I have a question for Ms. Haven. Ed.
Mr. Tankard?
Yes, she mentioned that they spoke of a bulkhead, but did they speak of the bulkhead that the staff had recommended, one that would be at the level of the current marsh that we see in the photos instead of a bulkhead that would be higher than that? That would include the fill that was proposed.
Ms. Havens, can you respond to that?
Yes, we did discuss a low-profile bulkhead, and part of the problem with that, we felt, is that the boat traffic coming in and out of there is going to continue to send wakes up onto the area above the saltbush line, and as sea level rises, that salt marsh is just going to submerge and be covered, and then we're going to be left with a mud flat out there.
Further questions? Does anyone else wish to be heard on this matter, for or against?
Unmute all of the phones again.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to unmute all of them.
Probably that, don't worry.
All right, the phones have been unmuted. We hear no one else that wishes to be heard for or against at this time.
Mr. Commissioner, Mike
Yes.
Johnson.
Yes.
I do know Ron Owens, the Wetland Board planner, is available to speak. If you had any questions for him regarding the meeting and how the meeting went, I know you mentioned you had some concerns about, how, maybe some technical issues or just the difficulty of an e-meeting. So if you wanted to ask any questions of him, he is available.
I don't want to put him in an untenable position between he and the chairman of the board, but Mr. Owens, if you wish to make any comment, you're more than welcome to.
Commissioner Bowman, can you hear me?
I can. Do you solemnly swear the testimony that you'll give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir, I do.
Proceed, Mr. Owens.
So just wanted to make you aware that as Ms. Havens mentioned, it was a rather lengthy meeting. I think the meeting went rather well, and I think all bases were covered at the meeting. And as far as some of the understanding of the board members, they may not have fully understood it, but I feel that the meeting went as well as it may have went in person.
Okay. All right. Any questions for Mr. Owens by members of the commission? All right, thank you, Mr. Owens. The matters before the commission for discussion and action.
Ed Tankard.
Mr. Tankard?
I appreciate the comments of the Gloucester Wetlands Board and also the agent for the applicant. I do think, though, that the argument that the agent for the applicant put forward for the idea that a low-profile bulkhead wouldn't be suitable was not as cogent as I would hope for. And my thoughts are that given the history of the Gloucester Wetlands Board and the work they've done in the past, I would have a tendency to remand this back to them to maybe look at it one more time. And that would be just a comment on mine to start with, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Tankard. Further comments by members of the commission? Further comments?
Ms. Everett would like to comment.
Ms. Edwards?
Everett.
I'm sorry, Ms. Everett?
Yes, thank you. Just in response to Mr. Tankard's suggestion or kind of question, I guess could we ask of staff if they feel like that's the most comfortable proposal moving forward, sending it back to the Gloucester Wetlands Board, or do they feel like the proposals in their staff recommendation are kind of safest for the resource?
I have
Not your process here.
I have, in all due respect, Ms. Everett, I have a hard time asking an employee of the commission a question that is under the purview of the commission. I don't want to put him in that position. If you want to rephrase or ask the question in a different form, that may be fine, but to ask the staff if they think a remand is appropriate, I believe is not in order, in all due respect.
Yes, thank you for that comment. And would it be possible to just pull up the staff recommendation on the screen one more
Sure.
time? Can I ask that?
Yes, ma'am. It's coming to you right now.
Thank you.
Further questions by members of the commission? Okay. Chair will entertain a motion. I guess then before though, I will say this. I do have just a little bit of heartburn with the fact that there are two adjoining properties situated and designed in the manner in which they were. And this specific 105-foot section being singled out. But that being said, I believe that the Wetlands Board, by virtue of the request by the chair, which I give great deference to, I think could do some work with it as well. So the chair will entertain a motion.
This is Dr. Neal. I move to remand this issue back to the Wetlands Board for further consideration.
Motion made by Dr. Neal to remand back to the Gloucester Wetlands Board for further consideration. Is there a second?
So moved, Ed Tankard.
Tankard. Call the roll. Mr. France? Mr. France?
Aye.
Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin? Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett? Ms. Everett?
Can you hear me?
I
Aye.
can now. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Chair votes aye. A motion to remand back to the Gloucester County Wetlands Board is approved unanimously. Thank you all for your comments, and please, I full well know running this meeting virtually how difficult technology can be, but please make sure during your next proceeding that everything does go in the manner in which it should, and I look forward to your decision. And I thank the Gloucester County Wetlands Board as well as the agent. I know this may delay the project, but it's our duty and responsibility to make sure that we get it right. So thank you and staff for the presentation. Next item on the agenda is item number 6, City of Salem, number 19-1802. Who will be presenting that?
Rachel Peabody, Habitat Engineer.
Thank you, Ms. Peabody. You solemnly swear the testimony that you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir, I do.
Proceed, please, ma'am. Oh, are we ready? There we go.
All right. The City of Salem has requested authorization to install 2 temporary cofferdams within the Roanoke River to provide access for maintenance activities of the Mill Lane roadway bridge in the City of Salem. The project is protested by 2 adjacent property owners. Next slide. So here's just an aerial view of the City of Salem. You can see the arrow is along the Roanoke River that runs just southeast of the city. Next slide. And a zoomed in view of the project location. So Mill Lane Bridge that you see going over the Roanoke River is a bridge that is in need of maintenance. And the city has proposed to put in a series of 2 temporary cofferdams, which will allow the contractor to dewater half of the river, get construction access to the areas that concrete needs to be restored, which is along the abutments and span. They'll remove one, move on to the other side of the river, and do the same on the other side. Next slide. So these are basic project drawings that show what I just described, where you see AA is the location of the temporary cofferdam, which spans about half of the riverway. And then once that is dewatered, construction happens, it will be removed and then move over to the other side of the waterway. And the maintenance here is basically concrete maintenance. So there's areas where concrete is eroding and it just needs to be filled in, and that can only be done in the dry. Next slide. So here's just some pictures of the existing bridge. This is a bridge that's about 6 feet above ordinary high water, according to the city. And then on the picture on the bottom right, you can see that this is just an example of some of the eroding concrete that needs to be fixed along the entire portion of the bridge. Next slide. The project is being protested by 2 adjacent property owners. The property that you see with the arrow on the top of your screen is Mr. Joseph Smith, and the property on the bottom is Ms. Ann Price, who have both written and emailed the city and I about their objections to the project. Next slide. So Mr. Smith, who again, he's a representative of SMP Associates who is on the top of the screen, states that the bridge was not originally constructed properly to meet the flow through for high water requirements. And as a result, it has created a debris dam overflow during high water levels. So he would recommend that the bridge be replaced at a higher level so that it can withstand the Roanoke River during high water at Mill Lane. And Ms. Price, who is the property on the previous map on the lower portion of the map, had three major points. One, she wanted to ensure that there was no interruption of traffic flow during construction during the daytime hours, so it doesn't impact her business. The in-water portion of her objection was that she didn't want any damming or diverting of the river water flow during hurricane season, which she says is June 1 through June 30th, to prevent any additional damming that may increase flooding on her property. So she's asked for a time of year restriction from June 1 through November 30th of any in-water construction. And then she also requests that from the city that any portion of her property that needs to be accessed for construction, that they contact her to negotiate a construction easement agreement. Next slide. So the city has spoken with both property owners on the phone, is my understanding, as well as in person, and has provided me a response to their protests, which are in your book. Here is just an excerpt from the city response discussing the existing bridge. And after reviewing a replacement of the bridge, they discussed that it would cost about 10 to 20 times the the amount of maintenance to reconstruct it. It would have additional environmental concerns for entire reconstruction, as well as it would take longer, most likely than what they're estimating to be about 3 months construction at this point. And they think that if they were to reconstruct the bridge, it wouldn't make it, the requirements would not be give it much additional height as the existing bridge. Next slide, please. We did receive comments from Department of Wildlife Resources and through them the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where they both commented that all in-stream work within the river adhere to a time of year restriction from March 16th through June 30th of any year to protect the endangered Roanoke log perch. They also listed several standard in-stream conditions that are recommended for almost any of our construction activities in the Western Territories. And that's that all in-stream activities shall be conducted during low or no flow conditions. They use non-erodible cofferdams or turbidity curtains to isolate the construction area, and that they block no more than 50% of the stream flow at any given time. Next slide, please. So after careful review, staff understands the protestants' concerns related to potential seasonal flooding of their waterfront properties and the need for a higher bridge in the long term. The city engineer has reviewed the protestants' concerns and disagrees that the cofferdam will exacerbate any seasonal flooding on the upland properties. In addition, a time of year restriction as proposed by the adjacent property owner, Ms. Price, would limit construction only to the months of December through February when it's coupled with the recommended state and federal fisheries restrictions. The city has also evaluated alternative construction options to include not using cofferdams, but they must be able to dewater the abutments to install the concrete repairs. They have also evaluated a full replacement of the bridge and have determined it is outside of the current budget of the city and would result in larger environmental impacts. As such, staff does not see a reasonable solution to accommodate the concerns of the protestants while allowing the necessary repairs to the aging bridge. Accordingly, after evaluating the merits of the project against the concerns expressed by those in opposition to the project, and after considering all the factors contained in 28.2-1205 of the Code of Virginia, staff recommends approval of the project as proposed with a time of year restriction from March 15th through June 30th of any year and the standard in-stream conditions outlined by the Department of Wildlife Resources. Thank you.
Thank you. I think in this scenario, we have to be very careful and what we consider based on what the city has requested and what the protestants have a problem with as it relates to the jurisdiction of this agency. The fact that someone wants a larger bridge or a higher bridge is certainly out of the purview of this commission. And I'd ask Ms. Block, do you have anything that you'd like to say before we proceed down the path of evaluation?
No, I think you've covered it. It's mostly, there are some complaints that are within the jurisdiction and some, such as requests about easement negotiation, that are outside of our jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you. Any questions by members of the commission for Ms. Peabody? Hearing none, thank you, Rachel. I see that the City of Salem engineering staff is on and wishes to be heard. Anyone from the City of Salem?
I don't know which, so we have a Will Simpson and a Josh Pratt.
Do we have a Will? Who?
I have Rachel, which is which?
Rachel, Ms. Peabody, who would be from the city that we would be hearing from? Do you know?
Both Will Simpson and Josh Pratt are both from the city and have been contacting me in unison. So
okay.
We could start with Will and then see if he would like to pass it to Josh.
Okay. Mr. Simpson, do you wish to comment?
Yes, sir. Thank you for
yes,
having
sir.
me on.
Yes, thank you. Before you go any further, do you solemnly swear the testimony that you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir.
Proceed, please.
I just want to thank you guys for taking the time to hear us on this. I'm the city engineer for the City of Salem, and really, Rachel summed up everything perfectly. We are just looking to do maintenance on the bridge, and some of the maintenance that we have to do involves the piers and the abutments that are actually in the river. To construct a new bridge here, as one of the citizens has requested, is very it's just not feasible to do, considering we would have to raise the bridge significantly, which would impact all of the roads leading into it. We have an intersection just up from the bridge that would be totally taken out by raising the bridge. So the raising of the bridge is not feasible. The bridge is low. There's no doubt about that. But what we are just trying to do is keep the bridge in maintenance and keep the bridge viable for as long as we possibly can before we have to go down a route of possibly looking at a new bridge. But that's going to be years and years and years, maybe even decades down the road. So all we're looking to do here is just get the approvals to be able to put a cofferdam in to do the necessary repairs on the abutments.
All right, thank you, sir. Any questions by members of the commission? Thank you, sir. Does Mr. Pruitt wish to be heard, or Mr. Simpson, did you sum it up? That basically you were the spokesperson for the city?
Mr. Pratt is available now if he wants to talk.
Yes, this is Josh Pratt. I've got no additional comments.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else wishing to be heard in support of this project? Please put or write in that you wish to be heard to the host.
Unmute all of the phones.
Unmute all the phones.
Just in case. All right.
All phones are unmuted. Does anyone wish to be heard in support of this project? Is there anyone that wishes to be heard in opposition to this project? Is there anyone that wishes to be heard in opposition to this project? Is there anyone that wishes to be heard in opposition to this project? There being none, the matter is before the commission for discussion and action. Chair will entertain a motion.
This is Dr. Neal. Move to approve staff recommendation.
Thank you, Dr. Neal. Is there a second to the motion?
Second, James Minor.
Second by Mr. Minor. Thank you. Further discussion? We'll call the roll. Mr. France. Mr. Tankard.
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin. Mr. Zedrin.
He is unmuted, so he should be able to speak.
Mr. Zedrin.
Aye.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Neal.
Aye.
Mr. Minor.
Aye.
Ms. Lusk.
Aye.
Ms. Everett.
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone, and thank you for the presentation. Next item on the agenda is BRG Little Creek LLC, number 20-0226. Who will be handling this matter?
This
Ms.
is Rachel Peabody. Yes, sir. Rachel Peabody.
Thank you. You've been previously sworn. Would you proceed, please?
Yes, sir. So BRG Little Creek has an after-the-fact authorization request. They would like to retain and improve a previously constructed 33-foot by 30-foot enclosed open pile platform to be used for restaurant activities, and this portion is not after the fact, and to install a new 16-foot by 30-foot oyster reef below the platform along Little Creek at 4707 Pretty Lake Avenue in Norfolk. Next slide. The project takes place, like I said, along Little Creek before you get to the Shore Drive Bridge at a location previously known as Cutty Sark. So the restaurant was previously known as Cutty Sark. Next slide. Here is an aerial view that's most likely around 2018 of what the property used to look like. So the property has changed hands and is now being deconstructed or has almost been fully deconstructed except for the restaurant there that you see that's over the water. And it's being redeveloped and rezoned into a condo development that will have marina amenities as well as a restaurant that they would like to continue using with the platform that you see that goes over the water. Next slide, please. So when BRG Little Creek purchased the property, as they were going through the site plan review with the City of Norfolk and the rezoning, it was discovered that there was a portion of the restaurant that had been constructed over the water, and the City of Norfolk and the VMRC did not have any permits associated with the structure. Aerial imagery shows that it was built in 2011, so it's fairly recent. And it is a fully enclosed structure with the permanent restaurant equipment that's being used as an extension of the Cutty Sark restaurant at this time. So the applicant would like to just keep the open pile pier platform, which is the 33 by 30 platform, remove the rest of the siding and the roof, and install an open-sided gazebo over the platform. Next slide. So here you can see the drawings of the bottom right is just the existing platform that they would like to keep and redeck. And then the proposed roof gazebo structure that you see there that's open-sided. This has gone through a few iterations and they've shaved the project down to this. It started with an enclosed structure, and after further discussions with the City of Norfolk and the agent and VMRC, they have decided that they would like to have the gazebo open-sided and have offered to not put any long-term restaurant equipment on the structure. Next slide. They would also like to propose to build an oyster reef below the structure using oyster reef balls. And this is just a water quality component to the redevelopment of the entire property. Next slide. So this is a view of the site plan, the most recent site plan, just to give you an idea of how it's going to be redeveloped, so you can see where the pier plan fits into that. The top, you can see the new condos. At the bottom of the screen, you can see the restaurant and offices that lead to outdoor seating that will then lead to the covered deck as a restaurant lounging kind of amenity to the restaurant. As well as additional CDPA plantings and all of the approvals that they received through the city of Norfolk. Next slide. So there's two portions of this project. The first is that this is an after the fact authorization. And when reviewing after the fact authorizations, we have to determine whether this was a project that would have been approved at the time of construction, if a permit application had been turned in. And for restaurants over the water, we turn to the 2003 subaqueous guidelines for determining whether it's an appropriate use of submerged land. The guidelines give us a definition of water dependency by saying those water dependent structures are those structures and activities that must be located in, on, or over state-owned submerged lands. And it gives us two questions that we must affirmatively answer in order to get to that determination. And the first is it necessary that the structure be located over water? And two, is it necessary that the activity associated with the structure be over the water? In addition, the subaqueous guidelines guide the commission that in addition to other factors, the commission shall also consider the public and private benefits of the proposed project. And they should do this in consistency with the public trust doctrine. Next slide. So after staff went through those two questions, as we do for most of these projects, we consistently questioned the need to provide additional outdoor dining or seating, private outdoor dining or seating over state-owned submerged lands in cases of restaurant expansions. This use of the proposed facility is viewed as non-water dependent, and there's no inherent need to be sited over the water, while seating could be adjacent to the water or on the upland. As such, staff would not have recommended approval of the project when it was constructed in 2011, and we would have brought it in front of the commission with the same discussions at that time. Accordingly, staff recommends denial of the request to retain the unauthorized structure and recommends that the entire deck structure be removed. Staff supports the requested shellfish reef. If the commission feels that the after the fact request is appropriate to authorize, staff would recommend any approval be conditioned upon the payment of a triple permit fee of $300 and triple encroachment royalties of $4,455. The current owner did not construct the unauthorized addition to the restaurant. As such, staff does not feel that the assessment of civil charges is appropriate in this case. And that finalizes my presentation, and Rebecca Francis is the agent for the project.
All right, thank you. Any questions by members of the commission from Ms. Peabody? Okay, Ms. Francis, are you on?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can. Do you solemnly swear the testimony that you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Can you proceed,
Good
please?
morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to talk on about this project on behalf of the owners. And while I realize that this project doesn't meet the 2003 guidelines, I still believe that this project is really in the public's best interest in terms of utilizing the waterway. Rachel gave a very good history on the background. The covered deck was constructed around 2011 by the previous owners, and it was not a permitted structure, but it has been in use for nearly 10 years. It has been associated with a restaurant that is open to the public, and is a highly popular location for dining and socializing. So it is currently a well-used facility.
What is the
Yes.
integrity of the structure at the present time?
The architect for BRG is here. I know that they are replacing the roofing and the decking. So I know it is currently used, but I cannot speak to the structural integrity of the structure at the moment.
Okay,
But
proceed.
that it is being used.
Yeah,
Okay.
proceed. I didn't mean to interrupt. Proceed, please.
Okay. The current owners, when they purchased the property, that was one of the unique selling features, was the covered deck, since it has been a unique amenity for the property, and once again, it is used by the public. The site development plans for the property show an improved and repurposed covered deck. The deck and roofing will be improved, but it will be an open-sided structure, which is more in line with the guidelines. The entire riparian apportionment on the east side of that embayment, where the deck is located, belongs to BRG. So there are no public boat slips or water access from the property. And it is also, as you can see in the photos that Rachel showed, it's at the end of a man-manipulated embayment that ends about 125 feet north of the pier. Therefore, this is not a thoroughfare, so we're not impacting navigation at all. So it's not a destination for any boater beyond the enclosed pier, other than a few private slips that are owned by BRG. So the enclosed pier does not have an adverse impact on the public's use of the waterway. Additionally, the upland area is private property. Thus, the general public doesn't have access or use of the shoreline unless it is associated with the restaurant and the covered deck. And so the public really has more use of the state-owned area than if the deck did not exist. I also want to mention that I did not do an exhaustive research list, but there is precedent for allowing BRG to maintain the covered deck and improve it. Project 18-1076, Ernie Styron, the applicant purchased the property with a covered storage shed over state-owned bottomland. The commission voted to allow the Styrons to maintain the covered shed for their private use, and that was a private use. And then 15-1779, Matt's Barge in Norfolk, the commission allowed the owner to maintain a previously unauthorized covered deck as part of their restaurant. So once again, there is precedent for allowing these structures. The city has approved the site plan, and in discussions with the city, the municipality indicated that due to COVID-19 health concerns and the continued practice on social distancing, they encourage the development and use of as many outdoor activityscapes as possible. And this outdoor pavilion space will certainly provide an enhanced outdoor gathering for community members and the public who are utilizing the restaurant to safely socialize outside. Once again, as Rachel mentioned, there's also a water quality benefit associated with maintaining the permanent structure. And as part of that application, BRG has worked with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to design an oyster garden under the enclosed decking. So I really submit that the covered decking is in the public's interest. It would not be in the public's interest to remove that structure. Without the decking, there's extremely limited public access to the area, either by land or water, since it is accessed by private property through a man-manipulated embayment. The covered decking has been a popular spot for nearly 10 years, and once improved, will be a safer area for the public to enjoy outdoor dining and socializing over the waterfront. And once again, there's already a precedent to maintain these types of structures. And that's all I have. Thank you.
I understand the precedent aspect of it, but each case is judged on its own individual merits based on the circumstances that are provided. So to basically paint it with a broad brush as a precedent, and therefore, since that was that way, this one should be that way, I don't think is appropriate in this matter. But we'll take it into consideration. Ms. Mott, would you please put the picture back up, an overview of the actual overview picture of.
One more.
Yes, ma'am. One more.
I'm sorry, this is,
Yeah, one more. Small. Yeah. I have a question for Ms. Peabody before we go. Those waterways through there, I'm going to presume that they were man-made cut canals or not? Is that natural?
that was a big debate. I spent a lot of time looking at historic topo maps and historic imagery from VMS. And it looks like the entire area of Pretty Lake was a sandy shoal, a shallow shoal kind of beachy area. And after reviewing a lot of the historic imagery, it looks like at least where Cuddy Sark was, it was natural water there. But in other locations, like you can see to the left of the screen, that peninsula, that was definitely man-made. So we determined that this portion of the waterway was most likely natural state-owned submerged lands when it was developed and before, you know, the upland was developed.
So it's kind of like the chicken or the egg, which came first, the water was there and then the fill came afterwards. Is that basically what we're looking at?
Yes, sir. I think what it was where you see most of the fill now, where you see the upland now, was a shallow sandy beach area. And meanwhile, water kind of went back and forth depending on where the sand moved. And so where you see the water now was most likely where their water was when this was constructed, when the upland was constructed.
Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Commissioner Bowman?
Just a minute, Any questions from Ms. Peabody as a follow-up to mine? Ms. Francis, I don't normally go back like this, back and forth, because this is a virtual meeting. What point did you want to make?
It wasn't her.
I'm sorry.
That was Christy Everett.
I'm sorry, Ms. Everett. I'm sorry.
No.
I don't have the benefit of the light, but go ahead, please, Ms. Everett. Your inquiry?
No problem. Yes, I wanted to know, Commissioner Bowman, if I could answer a question or make a comment to Ms. Francine at this time.
Oh, absolutely. You sure can.
Thank you. Ms. Francine, you mentioned working with Chesapeake Bay Foundation in a capacity to plan to build some reef balls. I just wanted to challenge that statement a bit. I actually work with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and am aware of plans for reef ball planting, and I don't believe CBF is aware and or involved in any such plans. So I think I would push back on that assertion there.
Can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
No, we actually met with Shannon out at the site, and she brought a probe, and we probed all around the pier, and she agreed that it would be a good place for a site, and she provided me with the literature and such on the reef ball. So I don't know that she's actually seen the final plans, but no, we had Chesapeake Bay out at the site, and once again, she brought her probe to check the bottom to make sure it was suitable for a oyster garden.
Well, if I could just follow up a bit, I will say if there was a particular advice given, I think it would stop there. It's not a project that Chesapeake Bay Foundation is planning. So happy to circle back on that, but I just think there's a little bit of a difference of opinion in terms of Chesapeake Bay Foundation's involvement.
And I'll agree with that. I guess I should say we coordinated with them. That probably would have been a more appropriate statement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else wish to be heard in support of this project?
So David Pence and Jimmy Parker, I believe, are both in support.
Is there Mr. Pence wishes to be heard? Mr. Pence? Mr. David Pence? I hear not. Is there a Mr. Jimmy Porter that wishes to be heard? I'm sorry, Jimmy Parker.
Yes, good morning. This is Jimmy Parker.
Mr. Parker, do you solemnly swear the testimony that you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir, I do.
Proceed, please, sir.
Good morning. So my name is Jimmy Parker with Bonaventure, the applicant, and Rachel and Rebecca did a great job, and I just wanted to say thank you to staff for your thorough review of the project. As Rachel mentioned, our hope is to continue to work with the city in hopes of retaining and permitting this existing pier. And our goal of the project would basically be to remove the existing restaurant and the existing enclosed structures and leave the remaining pier that's there and just put an open air pavilion on top and use it as some restaurant seating. As Rebecca mentioned, the city has expressed interest in having some additional outdoor seating areas as we're all continuing to focus on safely socializing outdoors. And I think that this would be a great way to help them with that initiative. That is really all I had. In addition to Rebecca, who's also representing Bonaventure today, I'm here and happy to answer any questions on behalf of Bonaventure.
Thank you, sir. Any questions by members of the commission for the gentleman?
I have one, Commissioner.
Mr. Tankard, proceed, please.
When this facility was bought, and that was recently, as I understand it, did they have any understanding that this pier, as you mentioned, was not permitted?
We did not know that the pier was not permitted at the time. We realized that upon buying it, and we realized that this is a widely visited and enjoyed destination by a large amount of the community. And our hope is to just kind of maintain the existing pier and retroactively permit this, and at least the existing pier portion, and then also for the open air pavilion and oyster garden. And we would like to just try and maintain that to for the public's continued enjoyment and public benefit.
Further questions by members of the commission? Anyone here in opposition to this project wishes to be heard? We'll unmute the phones. The phones are unmuted. Anyone wishes to be heard in opposition to this project? Anyone in opposition to this project? Thank you. The matters before the commission, the matters before the commission for discussion and action.
This is John Zedrin.
Mr. Zedrin, proceed, please, sir.
This is a very good project. I'm very familiar with it. In fact, I have my boat hauled right there at that Cutty Shark boat yard for many years. There is, to the north of that pier that they're asking for to put this pavilion, is a city water outfall from these condominiums and houses to the north. This is known as East Beach, and it is a golf cart community. And at 5 o'clock, there are a tremendous amount of people that are in this community that come to that restaurant. The restaurant is actually a very small restaurant without that addition of pier. And I think with the oyster issues, that water there could definitely use some cleaning up as far as that. But this would be an excellent location for this project as proposed. And I think it is would be supported by the whole community right there, because like I said, at 5 o'clock when the yard stops, the people come in and there's music out there. And I recall a while back, there was a similar situation on the Eastern Shore. There was a pier and a restaurant that appeared at the end of the pier, and a lot of people enjoyed that restaurant, and we permitted that as well. So I would think this would be great for the city, great for the developer, and great for the people.
Is that a motion?
I'm moving to approve the project as presented.
Motion made by Mr. Zedrin to approve the project as presented. Is there a second? Is there a second to the motion?
Not a second.
Is that Mr. Minor?
Yes.
Thank you. Further discussion? Further discussion? Well,
Mr. Bowman? This
yes.
is Rachel. Can we get a clarification if that motion was to include the triple permit fee as well as the encroachment?
Mr. Zedrin, that was what your intent was to support staff recommendations, or
Yes.
what?
Yes, that would
Okay.
be fee and what was recommended by the staff.
Okay, and Mr. Minor, that's okay with you as well, or not?
With me, that's fine.
Okay, so that's what it is.
I'm not sure. Commissioner Bowman, could we pull up staff recommendation for consideration, given that the motion refers to it?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I just question of clarity, if I may.
Yes.
Mr. Zedrin's motion proposed approving the project as in the application.
Good morning, Michelle. How are you?
Yet at the same time, it sounds like there is a understanding that the staff recommendation portion of the civil penalty would be consistent with the motion. So to me, I just needed some clarity. The motion on the table does not support staff recommendation in terms of approval or denial of the actual request to retain the unauthorized structure, correct?
If I'm correct, I believe that yes and no, and I'll try to answer it, and I'll see if Mr. Zedrin is in agreement without putting words. Mr. Zedrin, why don't you tell me what in looking at staff's recommendation, what your motion is again, please?
All right, again, it's approving the shellfish reef and the after the fact construction conditioned upon payment of triple permit fees of $300 and triple royalty fees of $44.55.
And that's seconded by Mr. Minor, correct?
Yes.
Further questions, Ms. Everett, at this point?
Yes. Yes. So I know we covered the shellfish reef in the proposal as well as the after fact request. Mr. Zedrin, did you refer to the denial or the approval of the request to retain the unauthorized structure and that structure to be removed? I'm just a little bit unclear on that. I apologize.
No, okay. The motion supports the maintaining the structure as proposed. And the reason I say that, they're talking about taking that down and putting that gazebo up there. That's why I made the motion that way. It is that's the proposal that it's going to go with, but it's going to maintain the pier. And so in that light, I'm going to approve the after the fact request to maintain the pier based on the payment of triple permit fees of $300 and triple royalty fees of $44.55.
Does that clear it up, Ms. Everett?
It does clear it up. I just wanted to understand, which I think I do, that the first portion of that motion does not concur with staff recommendation. Some of staff recommendation, there's in 3 portions.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Further questions by members of the commission? Well, I think
Commissioner Bowman, may I make a comment, or do I make a comment on the motion?
No, ma'am. You can this is matters for discussion.
I guess I would just pose, Ms. Francine had mentioned in her comments that there's other projects. I know there was taken exception to that comment of others being in a, kind of precedent setting. And I guess I would just, I do have a little bit of concern that, obviously every time there is a decision, the next decision bases it on, the current or past decisions. And I guess I would just push, we heard at the beginning of this proposal that, we have to look at what criteria and examination it would have been given if it were first submitted. And are we, by proposing that first portion of the motion, kind of saying that even if something's after the fact, obviously there is a change in ownership, which is an unusual situation here, and I sympathize with that. But it wouldn't have been given permission initially. but it is the second time around. I do think that we really need to be very cautious in terms of the decision-making we're proposing here, because again, it will be a precedent for future decision-making, and to me, might say to future applicants that aren't requesting the appropriate permits, they might have better luck if they just wait until they're caught, so to speak. So I just wanted to express that caution and concern.
Well, and I fully understand that. My comment was going to be that, had this structure been in a different location without it being in such a congested environment with a lot of different things going on around it, I'm not going to call it noise, but it's not in, and I'm not demeaning an area, but it's not a pristine open area in which encroachment over the waters of the Commonwealth of Virginia would cause an impediment or degradation of water quality or things like that. If this place had been somewhere else, out in the middle of an open view shed or adjacent to a state park or something like that, I would not in any way support maintaining anything that was not water dependent unless that certain facts were really, really out there that supported a need for it. But this being where it is, and again, that's why I asked about it being in a man-made canal, is what caused my hackles to go up a little bit about precedent setting. I think if you go back and look probably at those things that we had approved that are so-called precedent setting, I would think the environment would be probably likely to what you see here. So I think the commission and the staff both have been very, very diligent in ensuring that things that go over the water that may or may not be water dependent, we've been doing a pretty good job as far as protecting the interest. So I fully understand what you're saying. And again, if this had been in a different location, in the middle of a view shed, in the middle of somewhere, I would not support it. But that's the reason I asked the question I did about the environment upon which it's situated. So, but your point is well taken, ma'am.
And your point is as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Any further comment?
Yes, I have one, Ed Tankard.
Yes, Mr. Tankard, proceed.
It certainly as well gives me pause to see state water, state bottom become more or less private property for the enhancement of someone's bottom line or asset base. And I will recall the project in Cape Charles. What we had was permitted, that which was permitted over water. That was all permitted. We went from, I think, allowing serving of drinks to allowing there to be a more or less a restaurant. So there's sort of a bit of an enhancement there. So it's a bit different than what we see here. Again, we weren't in the Cape Charles moving to approve a non-permitted structure over state bottom. So, however, having said that, I agree with you, Mr. Bowman. The context of where we find ourselves on this project seems as though it is a public benefit that is probably outweighs the small amount of problems that we might incur over state bottom in an area like this.
Thank you, Mr. Tankard. Further comment? No further comment. The chair will call the question. Mr. France? Mr. France? Thank you, Mr. France. It's not your fault. We're having a little trouble with the connection here, but thank you for your patience for sure. Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin?
Aye.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Mr. Bowman,
Yes,
if I
Ms.
may.
Everett. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, I do think that the context is very important on that vote, and I just appreciate the commission discussion and thoughtfulness to help us get to that decision. So just wanted to add that.
Your comment is always welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's why you're on the commission, for sure. Next item on the agenda is item number 8, Oscar Harrell, number 19-0182. Who has this project?
Good morning. This is Allison Lay, Habitat Engineer.
Morning, Ms. Lay. Do you solemnly swear the testimony that you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Would you proceed, please, ma'am?
Yes. So Oscar Harrell is requesting authorization to construct a private open pile pier with a 36-foot by 18-foot open-sided boathouse and a 20-foot by 20-foot open-sided gazebo roof at property 5232 Ivy Lane, situated along the York River in James City County. The project is protested by 2 adjacent property owners, and we also just received another protest from a neighbor within the same community also protesting the project. Can everyone see the slides? I think for me it's just a gray screen.
I don't know, it's just a gray screen, something is over it, I think. Yeah, that's good.
How about now, Ms. Lay?
It still just says gray screen for me, but if everyone else can see it.
Hang tight.
Okay. There we go. I can see it now.
All right, proceed, please, ma'am.
Thank you. So if you go to the next slide, this is an aerial photo showing the location of the project. It is located in a small neighborhood that's just north of the York River State Park along the York River. Next slide. This is an aerial view closer up on the property, and this emblem here is showing where the pier will be located along the shoreline. Next slide. This is a plan view drawing showing the configuration of the pier. The pier itself is statutorily authorized by the Code of Virginia, but the boathouse and gazebo roof will require a subaqueous permit since they are protested. Next slide. This is the cross-section view of the boathouse. It will be 36 foot by 18 foot. Next slide. This is a cross-section view of the gazebo roof, which will be 20 foot by 20 foot and will cover the L head portion of the pier. Next slide. This is a photograph taken on site, and this is standing at the top of the cliff. So the property kind of has a steep cliff going down to a sandy shoreline, and this is taken at the top of the cliff. In this photo, you can see a duck blind, which is the subject of some of the protest. Next slide, please. This is the bottom of the cliff showing the sandy shoreline. This will be where the pier will be constructed from. Although it is outside of VMRC's jurisdiction, the applicant is proposing a cliff climber elevator system to access the bottom of the shoreline and the pier. Next slide, please. This is showing the oyster ground lease that is adjacent to the property. The pier will extend into this oyster ground lease. The leaseholder was notified of the project and is not protesting. Next slide. So the 2 protests that were received initially were from Ms. Woodward and Mr. and Mrs. Mrazek. Ms. Woodward is the downstream property owner, and she had several concerns about the project. She is concerned that the applicant does not live at the property, that hunting is allowed on that property, and that the applicant does not help maintain the shared road and is worried that the pier will attract trespassers. Mr. and Mrs. Mrazek are the upstream adjacent property owners, and they have similar concerns to Ms. Woodward, but also expressed concerns about the environmental impact of the pier and the walkway down the cliffside, heavy construction vehicles using the private road, noise pollution affecting eagles and osprey, the use of the pier for duck hunting, that the pier may not be properly maintained, and that the pier is too close to their property and will cause a loss of privacy and a loss of access if they were to choose to build a pier in the future. As I said earlier, we did receive another protest from Mr. Roger Hall, who also lives in the neighborhood. He voiced similar concerns as Ms. Woodward and Mr. and Mrs. Mrazek, and specifically mentioned the duck hunting that is occurring offshore of the applicant's property. Next slide, please. This application meets the pier design criteria listed in section 28.2-1203A of the Code of Virginia for statutory authorization for private piers. However, since the application is protested, it requires a subaqueous permit. Staff understands the protestants' concerns regarding the proposed roof structures and the impact they may have to them and their property. However, there are several boathouses and gazebos constructed within the area upriver from the applicant's property. Accordingly, after evaluating the merits of the project against the concerns expressed by those in opposition to the project, and after considering all of the factors contained in 28.2-1205 of the Code of Virginia, staff recommends approval of the boathouse and gazebo roof as proposed. And I'll take any questions you have for me at this time.
Any questions on that position for Ms. Lay? Thank you, Ms. Lay. Is the applicant present or represented? Is Oscar Harrell on the phone? Or agent for Oscar Harrell?
I got Oscar. I will unmute him.
Mr. Harrell?
Oscar's on the phone. Appreciate
Yes, sir.
you taking time to.
Yes, sir. Mr. Harrell, just a minute. Mr. Harrell, do you solemnly swear the testimony that you'll give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Proceed, please. Thank you.
Well, number one, there is no hunting allowed on the property. Ms. Woodard was told a year ago the hunting is not allowed. There will be no duck hunting from the pier. Why they want to claim that, I have no idea. The project will be built from the river. There will be no heavy equipment down the road. I think most of their complaints are with really related to the duck blind. I have told the gentleman I gave permission he could construct the duck blind. He can no longer hunt on the duck blind. He realizes that. He says he is going to remove the duck blind. I really think the duck blind is their main concern. They say it is very noisy, a lot of shotguns, and actually I think I wouldn't want it in my backyard either. And I have told the gentleman he cannot hunt it anymore. And I think that should take care of most of their comments.
All right, sir.
And I appreciate your consideration and ask you to approve the pier for the use of my family and grandkids and so on.
All right, thank you, sir. Any questions by members of the commission for Mr. Harrell? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Harrell. Is the agent for Mr. Harrell present, Alicia Randall or Brian, or anyone wishes to be heard?
This is Brian. I don't have any comments on, they both covered it pretty well.
But what is your last name, sir?
Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. Anyone else in support of this project? Okay, I have wishing to speak a Dr. Jack Mrazek as a protestant. Dr. Mrazek, are you on?
Yeah, I've been muted.
Okay, you're unmuted now. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please proceed.
I'd like to thank the board for their time and willingness to listen. My wife and I are the immediate neighbors to this property, just north. And I think this is probably the 10th time the board has been presented with variations of this option to go forward with construction. The elimination of the breakwaters and the beach, which were previously listed, I certainly think will eliminate some of the environmental impact that the board was concerned about. I am concerned about the construction process. I don't know how much of this construction would take place from the river versus down the road. I've been assured by engineers that it can't all be done from the river. It would have to come down the private road, traversing about 2,000 feet of road which I own and which my neighbors have access to or rights to. It's already been mentioned that we are concerned about degradation. We're concerned about noise pollution. I think the biggest thing that bothers the neighbors is the fact that the Harrell family is clearly demonstrated and indicated that they have no plans to build a house and live there. That being said, there's nobody going to be present to monitor or supervise this dock and its boathouse, etc., which in my mind presents a situation for profit, i.e. people using it for fishing or other duck hunting, etc., or plain mischief, since we're at the end of the road, so to speak. Access from the river via this dock to our private properties is not highly looked upon. All that having been said, this is Mr. Harrell's property, and I guess he can do with it what he wishes. If the board does decide that they will allow this to go forward, I would only make one other comment, and that is I would request that the dock, the 300-foot or 298-foot dock that goes out into the river before the structure goes up is parallel to the existing ones south and north and not skewed towards my property. It's already been mentioned that the cliff that exists is going to require some sort of a conveyance for Oscar's family to get down the hill if we actually intend to use this at some point. The cliff is much steeper as you get to my property, and so skewing the dock towards my property would directly impact on my ability to build the dock at some point in the future. All that said, if the dock that goes in is parallel to the existing ones, I would not oppose it.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, let me ask Mr. Harrell that question. Mr. Harrell, are you intending to build the pier perpendicular to the shoreline? In other words, in a straight line from the shoreline, or is it your intent to in any way contort it one way or the other? The pictures seem to be indicating that, if I've got the right picture, that, well, what's your intent?
The pier will be built perpendicular to the shoreline.
Thank you, sir. And you were under oath when you said that, so thank you very much.
Well, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Any further questions for Dr. Mrazek from members of the commission? Thank you. I have a Mr. Roger Hall protesting. Mr. Hall.
I don't see him on the list. Let me unmute all the phones
All right.
again.
All right. All the phones are now unmuted. Is Mr. Roger Hall on the line that wishes to be heard? Hearing no response, we'll mute the phones back. Is there anyone else in opposition to this project? Seeing none, the matter is before the commission for discussion and action.
Ed Tankard here.
Mr. Tankard.
You know, given that Mr. Harrell stated that he's going to place this dock perpendicular to the shoreline, I really see no reason we should not permit this. I would move to approve staff recommendation here.
Thank you, Mr. Tankard. Is there a second to the motion?
This is Dr. Neal. I second the motion.
Thank you, Dr. Neal. Further discussion? We'll call the roll. Mr. France. France? Thank you, sir. Mr. Tankard?
Yeah.
Mr. Zedrin?
Aye.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you all very much for the presentation and the hard work on this matter. Things work out fine. It's very important for neighbors to get along. It's my hope that they do. The next item on the agenda is item number 9, Jane Pawelski, Oyster Planting Ground application number 2016244. Who has this matter?
This is Ben Stagg, Director of Shellfish Aquaculture, Leasing and Mapping.
Mr. Stagg, you solemnly swear the testimony you give today be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Proceed, please, sir.
Thank you. This is an oyster planting ground application received from Jane and Richard Pawelski back in 2016. They requested at least approximately 1 acre of oyster planting ground within Chincoteague Bay in the town of Chincoteague, which is in Accomack County. The project is protested by an immediately adjacent property owner. Next slide, please. Here's a locational map. You can see the bridge going over from the mainland to Chincoteague. The application is to the north. Next slide. A little closer view with aerial photography. The commission members may remember this location. They did hear an oyster planting ground application to the south and offshore previously, which is shown here as an application that has been assigned. Of course, it was modified to avoid the SAV that's shown in this map. The current application is shown at the end of the red arrow and is adjacent to the Pawelski's property. The protestant owns the property to the south and owns the pier you can see in this picture. Next slide. So this is a county tax map depiction of the Pawelski's lot. And the area of the application actually goes to the south of their property line to some degree, as shown here. The pier to the south has had a finger pier added to it since this photo was added. The depths in the area range from mean low water at the shore to about -3 feet offshore. The bottom is mostly a mix of sand and mud. There are a small amount of clam and oyster resource in the area. The Pawelskis indicated in their lease application that they would use this as a traditional use ground, bottom culture, and that they did not plan to put any bottom structures on the lease, but of course would be allowed to by regulation. Their highland property is approximately 75 feet wide at mean low water, and the Pawelskis have a pier on the north side of their property, which you can see in this photo. There is considerable submerged aquatic vegetation offshore. In response to our public interest review, we received a protest from Mr. and Mrs. Gary Hollingsworth, who own the property to the south. They stated that part of the oyster ground application was actually in front of their property and would prefer that the lease stop at the approximate property line between their property and the Pawelskis, which would be approximately 20 feet north of the current surveyed line. Next slide, please. So this is an aerial, this is a ground photo taken looking down the Hollingsworth Pier. The stakes you can see in the photo represent the corners of the Pawelski survey. Next slide. It's a little closer view coming down the pier. Again, you can see the stakes. So the inshore most white stake, and then the offshore that's just to the right of the end of the Hollingsworth Pier. Those would be the extent of the southern boundary of the Pawelski survey. This is obviously not low tide. And that's the finger addition that was added to the Hollingsworth Pier that wasn't in the previous photo. Next slide. And this is offshore looking back at the Pawelskis and the Hollingsworth property. This has a little bit of history related to the pier and the addition to the Hollingsworth Pier, and the Hollingsworth objections relate to that and their concern of use of their pier. And I'll leave that at that. I think the Hollingsworths are here and will want to speak. Next slide. Again, this is the Hollingsworth Pier with the addition. You can see the offshore stake of the Pawelski application beyond that taller pilot. Next slide. Just within the last day, actually this morning, we received a letter from the Hollingsworth and this photograph that they provided, which is a little different perspective than what you just saw. But again, you can see the Hollingsworth Pier on the left, the two white stakes, which represent the southern boundary of the proposed lease, and approximately 30 feet. That is correct. I checked with our surveyor, and that's the distance we stayed off of the end of that finger pier was 30 feet. The Hollingsworth are requesting that we go another 20 feet to the north, is what they would prefer. And you can see the line superimposed here, which may or may not be completely accurate, but it's close. Next slide. So sorry to put a letter out like this. We don't usually put these in the presentation, but we just got this letter this morning. Commissioners might want to take a second to just read through this. This does have a quick synopsis of some of the background related to the dock, and then some additional background related to the lease from the Hollingsworth's perspective. It pretty much states similar noted. We'll leave that up for a second. So the original application was. Sorry.
Apologize. I was just going to say, would it be possible to just make the screen a tiny bit bigger just to be able to read more easily? If not, understandable.
That's a technical thing they'll have to try in the commission room. I'm not sure whether they can or not.
That's okay. No big deal. That's okay.
There you go.
Perfect. Thank you.
And we'll move it down as he speaks. Proceed, Mr. Stagg.
Okay. The original application was for an acre. However, since there was some emergent aquatic vegetation offshore, we eliminated that portion of it. We also tried to buffer the Hollingsworth Pier, leaving a 30-foot gap between the line and the pier. This reduced the area to only 0.16 acre in size. And again, it is 30 feet to the north of the Hollingsworth Pier. Unless y'all need to continue to look at that letter, we can go to the next slide. You can bring that back up when Hollingsworth speak if needed.
Okay, go to the next slide, please. Thank you, ma'am.
So this is a blown up version of the survey. The Riker application has now been withdrawn or terminated, so that's no longer active. The Salt Marsh Lane application was actually a Hollingsworth. That's been heard by the commission and assigned outside the SAV. The area is shown and shaded, and the Hollingsworth Pier is depicted where it says dock. Next slide. So had the applicant and the protesters been able to agree on the southern lease line, we would not have had to have a hearing today, and this would have been handled administratively. The applicant, however, was not willing to move the lease any further north than the currently surveyed line, as requested by the Hollingsworth. Had the Pawelskis agreed to the request, the proposed lease would be even smaller and would be approximately only 1/10 of an acre instead of 1/1600 of an acre. Based on the Pawelski statement that they intend to use the lease to grow traditional oysters and clams, and that they do not plan to put structures on the lease, and our belief that the Hollingsworth's access to their joint use pier will not be affected, staff has no objection to the application as amended to avoid the SAV. Accordingly, after considering all the factors contained in 28.2607 and 28.2205A of the Code of Virginia and the concerns raised by the protestants to Hollingsworth, we do recommend approval of the currently surveyed 0.16 acres of oyster planting ground within Chincoteague Bay. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I believe both the Paulwelskis and the Hollingsworths are on the line.
Any questions, Mr. Stagg, by members of the commission? All right, hearing none, is the applicant present or represented, Mr. and Mrs. Paulwelski? Who's going to speak?
I'm Jane Pawelski.
Do you solemnly swear the testimony that you're going to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Proceed, please, ma'am. And your first name was again what, ma'am?
I'm Jane.
Okay, Ms. Paulwelski, please proceed.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am, loud and clear.
Okay. Our family's had a home on Chincoteague for over 40 years, and we enjoy fishing and harvesting shellfish. We also appreciate the water quality benefits of aquaculture and are happy to do our part in the Chincoteague community. In September 2016, we applied for the lease we're talking about, for a 1-acre lease. It was published 4 times in the paper, and there was a 60-day protest window. Publication occurred in January and February 2017. I elected to use a surveyor provided by the commission. For whatever reason, it took until March of this year, 2020, to survey the property, and only after the surveyor provided by the commission determined the appropriate lease size and configuration, and considering all factors under the regulations, did our neighbors protest. I understand that I received a general oyster planting grounds lease. Although it is smaller than we expected, we trust that the surveyor, Mr. Cooley, as well as Mr. Badger and Mr. Stagg, have appropriately weighed the regulatory factors. We understand that neither we nor the Hollingsworths own the water. Neither they nor we are eligible for riparian planting ground assignments. Their pier is not a navigational access problem. The Hollingsworths no doubt know this, since they have an oyster application offshore for non-commercial shellfish activities. In any event, our dock is unobtrusive. Our neighbors have a long and wide dock that accommodates multiple boats, but the slips face the bay, not the oyster lease. Although we see no reason why the Hollingsworths would need to boat or kayak over the oyster lease, given the direction their slips face. It is simply not true that planting shellfish would prevent kayaking or boating. Chincoteague waters on our side of the bay are very shallow, but we use our fleets of small boats as the tide allows, and we request that the commission approve the application as originally surveyed. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, ma'am. Any questions of Ms. Paulwelski by members of the commission?
Here. John Zedrin here.
Mr. Zedrin, proceed, please, sir.
As originally surveyed, is that what we're looking at right now? Or is this the modified survey?
Mr. Stagg?
What you're looking at right now is the modified survey of 0.16 acres as was allowable, avoiding the SAV and trying to add some buffer distance away from the Hollingsworth pier.
And is that what the applicant wants us to approve?
I believe so.
Hi, this is Victoria Boylsky. I'm with my mom, Jane. Could you swear me in too?
Solemnly swear the testimony that you give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Great, thank you.
Yes, can you please, just wait a minute, can you, yes, ma'am, can you please?
I just wanted to clarify too.
Let me finish, ma'am. Ma'am, let me ask the question first and I'll let you go. Can you please respond, if that's what you're going to do, to Mr. Zedrin's question about what is being requested by the Pawelski family. That's what we want to know right now before we get to other.
Okay, so it sounds like there was something submitted in the last 24 hours that we weren't aware of. So our understanding that is that what's being proposed is the 1/6 of an acre does include the 20 or 30 feet, whatever it is, towards the Hollingsworth Pier. Is that correct?
Mr. Stagg?
So this is the area that was surveyed, it's not changed. The new information we got was just a picture and the letter from the Hollingsworth. This
Right,
is
so
what's
this is
presented in the photos were shown, and it is 30 feet from the finger pier of the Hollingsworth. My understanding is the Hollingsworth would like it to be another 20 feet further to the north, but that is not what we surveyed, and that's not what we're currently recommending.
Right. So we agree with what you surveyed, right, Mom?
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Did that answer your question, Mr. Zedrin?
Yes.
Thank you. Further questions by members of the commission? For Ms. Pawelski or Victoria Pawelski, either one, now that they're both been sworn. Any questions?
I have one question, just to make sure I'm understanding. They're not intending any cage or structures on bottom. Is that correct?
Right.
Thank you.
That would have been Jane Pawelski
Yes.
responding to the
I'm
survey.
Jane.
Thank you. Thank you. Further questions? Yes,
Yeah, this
yes,
is Chrissy
ma'am.
Everett. Just a clarifying question. I'm not sure if it's with Pawelski or her daughter, but the letter indicated the property was under contract to be sold. Just wanted to circle back to that. Maybe that's for staff.
Yeah, we don't know if we're selling the property. If we did sell the property, we'd consider what our legal rights were, but we don't know, in fact, that we are selling the property right now.
Okay, thank you.
But we understand we can keep the lease and it's inheritable from what I've read.
Further questions by members of the commission for the applicant or their agent? Thank you. Is Gary and Ulrike Hollingsworth present?
Yes. Yes, I'm
State your
here.
name.
This is
State your
Ulrike
name.
Hollingsworth.
Okay, do you solemnly swear the testimony that you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Can you state your case, please, ma'am?
Yes, sir. My name is Ulrike Hollingsworth. My husband, Gary, and I are the owners, and we object this oyster ground application due to its location. The public notice showed the Ms. Pawelski's oyster ground closer to her pier, which has changed when it was surveyed. As a matter of fact, Ms. Pawelski asked Mr. Cooley, the surveyor, to move it as close to our pier as possible. He told her that he has to stay at least 30 feet away from neighboring piers. However, her oyster ground is now at least 20 feet over the property line and makes it really difficult to maneuver our 22-foot pontoon boat over or even kayak without running over her oysters, if planted. We tried to resolve this issue and offered her an acre of our oyster grounds if she would move either over to the property line or offshore next to ours, which would increase her oyster grounds tremendously. Which has been vigorously refused. All these things went actually through VMRC, Mr. Badger, and Mr. Cooley. We tried to help and work this out, but it never came to that. We would also like to mention that the Pawelskis are in the process of selling their house and have no access to this oyster ground from land if they do so. We believe that this oyster ground is not about raising oysters anymore. It might have been at the beginning, but not anymore. Ms. Powalski and her husband are very upset about us actually extending our pier in last year. And Ms. Powalski now is using this as a way of punishing us because she's very unhappy with this pier. That's all I have to say. This states, this letter actually was sent on the 23rd. This was just notes for this hearing. Actually, this was not supposed to be a real letter. It was just what, you know, we stated, and we added a picture of the oyster grounds on it. Unfortunately, it got lost. I mean, the email was sent, and Mr. Stack can prove that, but there was no picture and no letter with it. So it was not just sent this morning. Unfortunately, it didn't come through.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Any questions of Ms. Hollingsworth by members of the commission? Thank you. Anyone else in opposition to this application? Phone's unmuted. Anyone else in opposition to this application? We'll close the phones. In this situation, either Victoria or Ms. Powalski, you've got 2 minutes to rebut what was said. Just a minute, please. Proceed, please.
Hi, it's Victoria. I just want to quickly say that we did not ask the surveyor to move the oyster lease towards the pier. That's not true. I believe, yeah. And then the other, in terms of access, I think regardless of whether we own the adjacent property, we can own the oyster lease and approach it by boat. Mom, do you have anything to add?
Yes, she mentioned that an offer was made to me extending it in another direction, so my oyster lease would be larger. No such offer was ever made to me. I don't know where she's getting this, but I'm really disappointed in her presentation.
It has been a contentious relationship. So
Okay.
On the oyster lease, and we appreciate
We'll
the commission considering it.
All right, thank you. Matters before the commission for discussion and action on this matter.
Ed Tankard.
Mr. Tankard from the Eastern Shore.
Yes.
Pearls of wisdom.
Well, I mean, since we've heard from the applicant that there will be no cages on the bottom, no structures, I fail to see where there would be any navigational hazard for the adjacent property owners. So thus, I'd move to approve staff recommendation.
Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Was that Ms. Lusk?
Sorry, that was Heather Lusk, yes.
Thank you. Further discussion? I'm sorry? No, not at this time. No one at this point, and the matters before the commission, motion has been duly made, seconded. The only thing I will say is these scenarios, I know that we are responsible for leasing the bottom lands of the Commonwealth for the propagation of oysters, but this scenario is one that bothers me significantly. I think that what is occurring here, right, wrong, or indifferent, is the utilization of the bottom lands of the Commonwealth for supposed oyster propagation, which basically in this scenario is nothing more on likely both sides as a method of retaliation or a way to cause problems. I don't like it, but that being said, that may be a deficiency in the law. We discussed spite leases when we were having our work group during the General Assembly. And these kind of scenarios truly do bother me. But the law is the law. I will call the roll. Good. Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin? Mr. Zedrin?
Aye. Aye.
Dr. Neal? Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes no. Motion passes. Thank you very much for your presentation. Next item on the agenda, and if it's okay with you guys, we'll take this last item, the Robert Rowe, and then public comments, and then we'll take about a 15-minute break after that. We'll give you the time, exactly what it is. But I think the staff, I know staff here definitely needs a break. They've been at it now for a couple hours without fail, helping me out, and I could use one too. So, like I said, we'll take the Robert Rowe case, then public comments. No, I'll tell you what, we'll just take the Robert Rowe case and come back and take public comments and fisheries matters after the 15 or 20-minute break. That's okay. If there's no problem with that. Item number 10, Robert Rowe, Oyster Planting Ground. Who's got that one?
This is Ben Stagg again, the Director of Shelters, Agriculture, Leasing, and Mapping.
You've been previously sworn. Proceed, please.
Thank you. So this is an oyster planting ground application from Mr. Robert Rowe, requesting to lease approximately 6 acres of ground in East River in Matthews County. The project is protested by an immediately adjacent highland property owner. Next slide, please. We did receive this application in 2018. This is the East River running north and south. The application is marked by the circular area in the northern part of East River. Next slide. A little closer view of the application area, shown again inside the circle. Next slide. So here's an aerial photo superimposed with our leases and the application as requested initially. The applicant did indicate when they applied that the proposed use would be traditional on-bottom planting and harvesting. This leased area does not contain any submerged aquatic vegetation. We did submit this to our normal public interest review. We did notify the adjoining property owner, Dorothy and Labasi, and we did receive comments from her back in 2018. However, she really just wrote on the notification we sent her that, quote, she did not want work done at our property. Subsequently, we did survey the area, and Commission Surveyor Kevin Sutton spoke with Ms. Labasi, who again reiterated objections to the project. So there's a little history related to this one. Next slide, please. This just shows the Labasi property. They own the 2 lots shown there, beginning where the L is, and the property to the east of that. Do have a pier adjacent to their property in that small cove on the eastern side of their property, and you can see there is somewhat of a channel there that comes out to the deeper water. But on the north shore of their property is a relatively shallow area before it drops off to a deeper depth. Next slide. Again, this is the application area. I've turned off the other leases here. This public ground to the north, just so you can sort of. So this area was previously leased by different members of the Labasi family since 1989 until August of 2017. Previous Labasi lease contained 5.83 acres and included an area nearer the shore than the current application and the area we surveyed. We did this year, after Ms. Labasi again expressed her concerns, she further claimed that the Labasi lease was taken from her and after she paid the rent on it in 2016, and she never received any rent bills. We checked our records, and according to our database, she did pay the rent in 2016. We did generate a bill for the 2017-2018 rent year in August of 2017. Our database also indicates the lease was terminated later that month at the request of the leaseholder at the time, which was Dorothy Labasi. While we no longer have a record of her termination request, when such termination request is received, a reason for terminating the lease must be entered into the database system, and in this instance, it was entered as requested by the leaseholder. A letter would also have been generated at that time to the leaseholder confirming that the lease had been terminated. In February of this year, we got correspondence and a renewed objection from Liz Nabasi. I'm sorry, in February of 2018, she did not mention her belief at that time that the leased area had been terminated in Ura. During the time the lease was held by the Labasi family, and since mandatory reporting has been required for shellfish harvest, we could find no report of any commercial harvest on the Labasi lease. Had the lease not been terminated in 2017, it would have been up for 10-year renewal in October of last year, and likely, unless additional information was provided, would not have been renewed. Next slide, please. Again, this is the initial entering into the database of her protest. Next slide. This is a letter that she sent. The Labasis did not have internet, so they had a neighbor send this letter yesterday. Again, these are, and I would like to read this into the record so that it is on record. So what both Darcy Labasi and her son, Michael Labasi, are stating here is that they are not interested in allowing Mr. Rowe to use our property for oyster planting and harvesting. We do not wish to lease it, sell it, or allow anyone to use it for this purpose. We use our property for recreational purposes as well as harvesting oysters. We also allow family, guests, and friends to do the same. We do not wish to have a corporation use the property we pay taxes on. Since we pay taxes, we believe it is our right to dictate how it's used. We've been told that Mr. Rowe farms property near ours. He does have leases in the East River nearby, and he wants to use our property for his convenience. We believe our rights to privacy and determination of how our property is used outweigh its convenience. We therefore respectively and strongly believe that Mr. Rowe's application should be denied. So in response to that, none of the area we are proposing to lease is privately owned. This is all state-owned subaqueous bottomland. So I want to make that clear. It's a little bit gray in that letter. The Labasi residence is some distance from both, their house is some distance from both the shoreline and the lease, and it appears that any direct view is probably blocked by vegetation along the shoreline. The near shore lease line, as surveyed, is approximately 40 to 90 feet offshore the mean low water line, and it does not appear that traditional on-bottom planting and harvest would adversely impact the shoreline or the near shore area. Again, Mr. Rowe does have 4 leases in the York River, and he does have 1 lease in the East River further downstream. He does have a history of commercial harvest on all 5 leases in recent years. Next slide. So this is the area as actually surveyed. We did stay a little further offshore than the previous Labasi lease that was there. The Labasi lease encompassed the red area, but also went closer to shore to the south and actually went inshore of the lease to the west along the shoreline. This photo is a little bit misleading in that the shore is further away than it might appear, because the darker area of those trees is actually shadows from the trees, which are actually further to the south along the shoreline. So there is some gap between the shore here and the proposed lease line. Again, the Labasis, it appears, would access their property and pier to the east through that channel area you can see that comes out into the lease to the east. Next slide. This is the plat of the survey. Again, the shoreline to the south there is not as graphically correct as it could be, but it's just shown as a straight line. But the distance between the shoreline and the lease is at the closest point 40 feet and about 100 feet at the farthest point, the inshore line of the proposed road lease. Therefore, after careful review and consideration of the objections of the nearby upland property owner, reviewing her complaint concerning the termination of the previous lease and the potential impacts of the leasing this area for shellfish propagation, we conclude that leasing appears appropriate as shown. Accordingly, after considering all the factors in 28.2607 and 28.2 1205A of the Code of Virginia, we We do recommend approval of leasing 4.79 acres as shown on this plat in the East River within Matthews County to Mr. Robert Rowe. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions by members of the commission for Mr. Stagg? Thank you. Hearing none, is the applicant on the phone, Mr. Rowe?
Yes.
Mr. Rowe, do you solemnly swear the testimony that you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Do you want to say anything about your application or what Mr. Stagg had to say?
He pretty much summed it up. I applied for that piece of ground for traditional harvest and traditional shelling. There'll be no bottom structures. And I also, you know, when I applied for the lease, I really didn't want anything in that shallow water. So that's why I didn't go all the way up to the mean low water mark.
Okay. Any questions by members of the commission of Mr. Rowe? Thank you, Mr. Rowe. Is anyone else in support of this application wishes to be heard? Phones being unmuted. Anyone else in support? Hearing none, thank you. I have the wishes to speak in opposition, Ms. Dorothy Libiasi. Ms. Libiasi, present. Wish to be heard?
I'm here.
Do you solemnly swear the testimony that you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Yes, ma'am. State your case, please.
My husband and I, first of all, I did send a letter in to Mr. Ben Skaggs stating my opposition. But I'd also like to say that my husband and I spent many long, hard hours and years working to earn the money to buy this property. In addition, we worked very hard turning this house and land into what we have felt to be our paradise. It is completely unjust to expect that we allow the applicant to modify the peace, tranquility, with noise and traffic that we have made for ourselves, just for his convenience.
All right. Thank you. Does any member of the commission have a question for Ms. Labasi?
John Zedrin here.
Mr. Zedrin, proceed, please, sir.
Did you and your husband harvest oysters on this property?
I'm sorry, I can't hear him.
Did you and your husband commercially harvest oysters on this property?
We do with, not commercially, but with family and friends and neighbors.
Thank you.
Further questions? Thank you. The matter is before the commission for discussion and action.
This is Dr. Neal. I move to approve staff recommendation.
Motion made by Dr. Neal to approve staff recommendations. Is there a second?
Second by Mr. France.
Second by Mr. France. Well, unlike the last application, I think this is a perfectly suitable use as the oyster ground is concerned. So, Mr. France.
Aye.
Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin?
Aye.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Minor? Mr. Minor?
Mr. Minor is no longer on.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Sorry about that. Aye.
No problem. Chair votes aye. Motion passes. Thank you. We're going to be in recess I have exactly 12:05 on the dot now. We'll be in recess until, let's say 12:25. That gives us 20 minutes. Get a quick break and we'll resume at 12:25. So we'll be in recess until that time. We'll call the July 28th, 2020 meeting of the Marine Resources Commission back to order. In order to ensure that we have a quorum, I will call the roll again. Seems unnecessary, but it is necessary. Mr. France.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Tankard. Mr. Tankard. Mr. Zedrin. Mr. Zedrin.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Tankard.
Hold on, let me try unmuting him. Try him again.
Mr. Tankard.
Nope.
Dr. Neal.
Here.
Mr. Minor.
Mr. Minor.
Okay. Ms. Lusk.
Here.
Ms. Everett.
Here.
Recalling Mr. Tankard.
Here.
Thank you, sir. Next item on the agenda are public comments. On the board indicates the directions of how you, if you wish to speak, to let the host, Ms. Madsen, know that you wish to speak. Is there anyone that wishes to be heard on public comments? And if you do, put there, and Ms. Madsen will let me know who it is, and I will then call your name.
I'll also unmute the phone.
And she'll also unmute the phone. Anyone for public comments? Are the phones unmuted?
Yep.
Anyone for public comments? Thank you. The next item on the agenda is public hearing. Proposal to amend 4 VAC 20-280-10 pertaining to speckled trout and red drum.
This is me.
Ms. Madsen.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. All right, I think we're all set now. Okay, so this is a public hearing. The proposal is to amend Chapter 4 VAC pertaining to speckled trout and red drum to modify seafood buyer reporting requirements for the purchases of speckled trout during the period of August 1st through November 30th of each year. Next slide, please. So for a little bit of background, speckled trout are managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And in 2011, the South Atlantic Board approved the omnibus amendment for spotted sea trout, AKA speckled trout, and Spanish mackerel. Now, in 1995, the commission established a self-imposed commercial speckled trout quota of approximately 51,000 pounds. And this was established using the average landings from 1993 and 1994, plus an additional 25%. We proactively established these quotas as a response to the recreational fishery restrictions that were being put in place. So as a reminder, the fishing season for speckled trout is a year, but it's September 1st of the first calendar year through August 31st of the following calendar year. Next slide, please. So after there was a quota overage of that commercial quota in 2012, in 2014, the Commission established some new regulations. The first being a weekly mandatory buyer reporting, which runs from August 1st through November 30th, and the second being a commercial management trigger. Now, this commercial trigger goes off when the commercial quota is predicted to reach 80%. We roll into a bycatch fishery with an 100-pound daily landing limit. So similarly, in the 2019 fishing season, we had a quota overage of about 81%. And this reason being was that on the week of October 9th, we had a very large harvest, which occurred very rapidly. This mandatory weekly buyer reporting phone calls were not sufficient in kind of notifying staff of the accurate harvest in a fast enough manner. And so we surpassed that bycatch provision, and the fishery closed down on October 16th completely. So through the rest of this season, the fishery is currently closed down. So essentially what we're proposing today is that we move into a daily buyer harvest reporting instead of a weekly one, and that will run August 1st through November 30th. And so, like I was saying, that'll start on September 1st of 2020, since right now the fishery is currently closed. Next slide, please. So we've made a couple of changes, and as you remember, fisheries staff have been going through and cleaning up regulations while they also go in and change the regulations. So any changes that you see in brown are just language changes. They're not a change to the intent of the regulation, and any changes that you see in yellow are actual changes to the intent of the regulation. So starting off with our definitions in section 20, that'll be on pages 1 and 2. The changes that we've made here is we've just removed some of the common names for red drum and speckled trout. We're trying to do this for clarity's sake. Essentially, if you listed all of the common names for our various species, it would be a very long list. So we're going through, cleaning up some of that language and just kind of getting straight to the point with these definitions. Next slide, please. On our next slide, it's section 40, possession limits, and that's on pages 2 and 3. There are some small changes in here. We're making sure that hook and line is written out correctly. We're trying to keep consistency throughout our regulations. Also in subsection A, you'll see that we've deleted the language except as described in subsection B of this section. Subsection B is deleted because it is from a 2014 cold stun. So this is very old language that just didn't need to be in regulation anymore. So we're just cleaning that up and pulling that out. And then the small changes that you'll also see is that subsections C and D will shift up to be B and C. And there is a small consistency language change to the word commission in section 50. Next slide, please. So this is where we'll start off with our actual intent to change the language here. This is section 55, seafood buyer reporting requirements, and you'll see this on pages 3 and 4. And so what you can see is we've crossed out the old language for the seafood buyer reporting requirements, and we've changed the language so that it says, any licensed seafood buyer who purchases speckled trout from August 1st through November 30th shall report daily purchases in pounds using the Commission's interactive voice recording system on the day of purchase. So these are the changes to that regulation. Next slide, please. We wanted to keep the Commission kind of in the loop on some future work that we would like to do with the speckled trout fishery. This fall, we intend on having an FMAC meeting. We have a couple of other large topics to discuss with that group. And any kind of management measures that we change to address the inadequacies of the reporting requirements today, we'll fill the FMAC in on, and we will also work with them to request a future workshop to start to address some longer term fisheries issues with the speckled trout fishery. In the meantime, the North Carolina group is working on a stock assessment for speckled trout and a subsequent status determination for that stock. North Carolina and Virginia are considered one stock, so this should give us some hopefully solid science to see how the speckled trout stock is doing. And finally, we hope that the FMAC will want to have a meeting in spring 2021 to evaluate some of the long-term fisheries issues that we're seeing with speckled trout. We might have a few follow-up meetings following that. We're not sure yet, just depends on how many things we need to talk to them about, and then we'll work with them to discuss the need for any potential regulation changes that will happen prior to the 2021 fishing season. You know, we very much respect our FMAC's opinions on our various fisheries, so we'll definitely want to consult with them about anything that we decide to change with the speckled trout fishery. Next slide, please. And so our staff recommendation here is that staff recommends the commission amend Chapter 4 VAC 20-280 pertaining to speckled trout and red drum to modify our seafood buyer reporting requirements for purchases of speckled trout during the period of August 1st through September 30th of each year. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Any questions by members of the commission for Ms. Madsen? There being none, this is a public hearing. Does anyone in the public wish to be heard on this matter? For or against? We will unmute the telephone. Seeing none, the matter is before the commission for action.
Madam Chair, I move that we approve staff recommendations.
Motion made by Mr. Minor to approve staff recommendations. There a second?
Dr. Neal, second.
Second by Dr. Neal. Thank you, sir. Mr. France?
Yeah, I'll support and say aye.
Thank you. Mr. Tankard? Mr. Zedrin? Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is public hearing proposal to amend Chapter 4, excuse me, VAC 20-252-10 pertaining to taking, again, excuse me, pertaining to taking a striped bass. Who has that one?
Hi, Mr. Commissioner. It's Olivia Phillips.
Ms. Phillips, good afternoon. Proceed, please.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a public hearing to amend Chapter 4 VAC 20-252 pertaining to the taking of striped bass to 1, require the use of non-offset, non-stainless steel circle hooks when fishing for striped bass recreationally with bait. 2, to clarify that the captain or operator of any recreational boat or vessel shall be responsible for any minimum or maximum size limits. And 3, to repeal Section 4 VAC 20-252-115, exemptions from size limits and closed fishing seasons for recreational striped bass fishing tournaments. And I'll go through these 3 issues in that order.
Thank you.
Okay, so issue 1, circle hooks. In October 2019, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission approved Addendum 6 of the Fisheries Management Plan for striped bass. Among other items which this commission has already approved and implemented, Addendum 6 includes a circle hook provision, which requires that anglers use non-offset, non-stainless steel circle hooks when fishing for striped bass recreationally with live or chunk bait. The implementation plan for this provision is due to ASMFC by August 15th and must be implemented by January 1, 2021. Next slide, please. So numerous studies involving marine and freshwater species of fish in both commercial and recreational fisheries have shown that fish caught and released while using circle hooks are more likely to survive than fish caught using standard J hooks when using natural bait. The most effective circle hook design, with no offset and the point curved into the hook's shank, tends to slide over soft tissue until reaching the corner of the fish's mouth. Circle hooks are far less likely to get caught in the fish's throat or stomach, which reduces the likelihood that the fish will die after it's been released. For striped bass in particular, discard mortality accounts for a substantial amount of removals, and the 2019 stock assessment assumed that 9% of all released striped bass experience mortality. So in other words, discard mortality is already relatively for recreationally caught striped bass. The Atlantic Striped Bass Management Board was further concerned that the strict size and possession restrictions in Addendum 6 could increase the number of released fish and potentially increase the number of removals through post-release mortalities. So the circle hook provision was approved in Addendum 6 in the hopes that it would aid in the reduction of discard mortality for striped bass in the recreational fishery. Next slide, please. There was some discussion about the potential enforceability and implementation of the circle hook provision. The ASMFC Law Enforcement Committee and the Atlantic Striped Bass Management Board agreed that angler education and outreach would be necessary for the success of the circle hook provision. And since then, in an effort to educate anglers about the upcoming provision, VMRC staff have created an informational card to be handed out with free circle hooks, as well as an educational webpage. Next slide, please. Okay, so now on to issue 2, enforceability of size restrictions. During the regulatory review process, law enforcement requested that staff add regulatory language that increased enforceability of size restrictions of striped bass possessed on a recreational vessel. So subsection 50C in the striped bass regulation specifies that the captain or operator of the recreational vessel is responsible for the possession limits, but no such language exists for size restrictions. So to increase enforceability of size restrictions on recreational vessels, staff recommends that the Commission approve new regulatory language, placing the responsibility of minimum and/or maximum size limits on the captain or operator of a recreational vessel. Next slide, please. And now our third issue, exceptions for special tournaments. In 2006, FLS Outdoors proposed holding the national championship for their striped bass tournament trail in Virginia Beach for 3 days in December. Although the tournament structure ensured live releases and penalties for any mortalities, some of the tournament rules partially conflicted with the Virginia striped bass regulations regarding possession of fish in the prohibited slot. In an effort to allow the tournament to take place, the Commission approved Section 4 VAC 20-252-115, which allowed a tournament to be exempted from size and/or season requirements under certain restrictions. Section 115 has not been applied or used since the FWL Outdoor Striped Bass Tournament held in December of 2006. Considering the current status of the stock, that it is overfished and overfishing is occurring, a special tournament would not fall within the goals of the FNP for striped bass and is not likely to be approved. Further, law enforcement expressed concern at the enforceability of the section, citing the FWL tournament as an example. They said that during the December 2006 tournament, it was difficult for law enforcement to determine which anglers were fishing legally as participants of the tournament and which anglers were fishing illegally. Staff believe that reviewing Section 4 VC 20-252-115 would increase clarity and enforceability of the striped bass regulation overall. Next slide, please. Okay, so you will likely recall that staff have made an effort to update regulatory language when we open up a regulation, just as Shanna mentioned before. Since the striped bass regulation is so long and the 3 issues brought before you are about the recreational fishery, staff focused on updating the parts of the regulation that pertain to the recreational fishery only. Staff will tackle the commercial fishery at a later date. So I will first explain the proposed amendments pertaining to the 3 issues discussed. And then I'll discuss the language changes and explain some of them in greater detail. Next slide, please. Staff added the ASMFC suggested circle hook definition to section 15 definitions on page 2 of the regulation. It reads, circle hook means a non-offset, non-stainless steel hook with the point turned sharply and straight back toward the shank. Next slide, please. Staff added 2 subsections in section 50 concerning recreational fishing general, which begins on page 6 of the regulation. Subsection B explains the circle hook provision and reads, any person fishing recreationally shall use non-offset, corrodable, non-stainless steel circle hooks when fishing with bait, live or chunk. And then subsection D is the new language pertaining to the enforceability issue of size limits and reads, when fishing from a boat or vessel where the entire catch is held in a common hold or container, the captain or operator of the boat or vessel shall be responsible for any minimum or maximum size limits. Next slide, please. Section 115 on page 10 of the regulation pertains to our third issue of special tournaments, and staff have proposed repealing this section entirely. Next slide, please. As for language changes that do not change the intent of the regulation, staff reorganized and updated language for clarification, efficiency, and easier enforceability in sections 20, 30, 50, 80, 90, 100, and 110. Staff also replaced the word individual or individuals with person or persons throughout the regulation, unless the word individual referred to an individual harvest quota. And lastly, staff repealed subsections within sections 30 and 50 because they repeated language that was found somewhere else in the regulation. Before I walk through why staff is proposing to repeal these subsections, I would like to assure you all that these changes were presented to the Regulatory Review Committee and issues of clarity, efficiency, and enforceability were all discussed and approved. Next slide, please. Subsection 30A on page 4 of the regulation restates the purpose of the striped bass regulation and refers to the Code of Virginia, which essentially restates parts of the preamble found on page 1 of the regulation, provided here in the blue box. Staff are proposing this subsection be repealed to reduce redundancy in the striped bass regulation. Next slide, please. Subsection 30B on page 4 of the regulation establishes that it is unlawful to possess striped bass when the season is not open in any given time, season, or with any gear. Staff has proposed that this subsection be removed because it merely serves to provide a general overview of what is already detailed in sections 80, 90, 100, and 110, found on pages 8 through 10 of the regulations. Section 80, 90, 100, and 110 detail the open seasons, size limits, and possession limits for each area within the Chesapeake Bay and the coast. I've included section 110, coastal area striped bass recreational fishery, here, beginning on page 9 of the regulation, as an example. Since these sections provide much more detail than subsection 30B, staff has proposed it be removed to increase clarity and efficiency of the striped bass regulation. Next slide, please. Subsection 30C on page 4 of the regulation establishes that all persons must follow the established size restrictions, except for those who hold an aquaculture permit. Section 30C provides a general overview of the size restrictions that are detailed in sections 80, 90, 100, and 110, as we saw on the last slide. Further, sections 170, 180, 190, 200, and 210 on pages 24 through 27 of the regulation establish the regulations specific to aquaculture. Staff proposes repealing subsection 30C to reduce redundancy and increase clarity and efficiency of the bass regulation. Next slide, please. Similar to previous sections, subsection 30D on page 4 of the regulation provides a general overview of restrictions, this time specific to size limits, which are also found in subsections 80, 90, 100, and 110. Again, I have section 110 here, beginning on page 9 of the regulation as an example. Size limits for each specific season and area are found in sections 80, 90, 100, and 110. So subsection 30D is redundant, and removal of this subsection would increase clarity and efficiency of the regulation. Next slide, please. Subsection 30G on page 5 of the regulation establishes restrictions specific to commercial hook and line as it pertains to striped bass. However, the exact same words can be found in Chapter 4 VAC 20-995-10 pertaining to commercial hook and line fishing, provided here in italics. Further, there's no other mention of commercial gears throughout the striped bass regulation, and there are no other restrictions specific to hook and line. Staff believe that removal of subsection 30G from the striped bass regulation will increase clarity and efficiency within the regulation. Additionally, law enforcement did not see a problem with removing subsection G from the striped bass regulation because it is found in the hook and line regulation. Next slide, please. Now moving into section 50, beginning on page 6 of the regulation. Subsection 50B provides a general overview of the area and season restrictions, but as we've seen before, those restrictions are detailed in sections 80, 90, 100, and 110, and thus staff propose removing subsection 50B to reduce redundancy and increase clarity and efficiency of the striped bass regulation. Slide, please. Staff have proposed the removal of subsection 50C beginning on page 6 of the regulation for the same reason. Subsection 50C also essentially describes the word daily. This was initially established because there was uncertainty about how the daily possession limit would apply to anglers who took an overnight trip. Essentially fishing over 2 days, potentially doubling their limit for the fishing trip if you count the daily limit as for each day you're fishing. However, staff felt that the daily limit described in sections 80, 90, 100, and 110 addressed this potential loophole because it is a possession limit. An angler cannot possess more than the daily limit, regardless of potential overnight trips. When staff consulted law enforcement supported removal of subsection 50C, citing the same reasoning, that the daily limit established in section 80, 90, 100, and 110 were clear, efficient, and enforceable, making 50C redundant. Next slide, please. In the new subsection 50F on page 7 of the regulation, staff proposed striking the sentence that reads, "Any striped bass caught that does not meet the applicable size limit shall be returned to the water immediately." Law enforcement supported removal of the sentence, citing that it is not necessary for law enforcement purposes because returning the fish to the water immediately is covered under the word possess in the first sentence of the subsection. If an angler can't possess a striped bass that doesn't meet the criteria, they would need to return it to the water. This gives law enforcement the latitude to distinguish between an angler holding a fish to remove the hook and toss it back versus the angler clearly keeping a fish that doesn't meet the correct criteria. Removal of the second sentence increases efficiency of the subsection, but maintains original intent and enforceability. Next slide, please. And lastly, staff proposed striking this subsection beginning on page 7 of the regulation because it simply restates the definitions for commercial fishing and recreational fishing, which are both defined in section 20 definitions beginning on page 1 of the regulation. Those definitions are provided here. Again, this change is to increase clarity and efficiency of the striped bass regulation. Next slide, please. Staff received 2 written public comments in regards to the proposed amendments to the striped bass regulations, and they have been provided to you for your reference. Next slide, please. Staff recommends the commission approve Chapter 4 VAC 20-252 pertaining to the taking of striped bass to require the use of non-offset, non-stainless steel circle hooks when fishing for striped bass recreationally with bait, to clarify that the captain or operator of any recreational boat or vessel shall be responsible for any minimum or maximum size limits, and to repeal Section 4 VAC 20-252-115 exemptions from size limits and closed fishing seasons for recreational striped bass fishing tournaments. And with that, I can take any questions. Thank you.
Probably need to take a deep breath, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Any questions by members of the commission for Olivia?
Yes, this is Dr. Neal.
Dr. Neal, proceed, please, sir.
The word bait, are we comfortable with that definition, meaning just natural bait? I mean, because if you ask what bait I'm using, I would tell you I'm using a stretch 30 or something like that. I mean, does bait commonly mean just natural bait?
Olivia, you want to take a shot at that, or Mr. Gear, or whoever's on the phone?
I can take a shot at it. So the definition we used here is what ASMFC defined as a circle hook. There's a similar definition that we used that you saw last month for pertaining to sharks. And I think the distinction here is we are including that, I believe we're including the words live or chunk as to specify. But we can be more specific if that's something that the commission wants.
What we'll do is I'll have Deputy Chief Madsen comment on that real fast. Shanna, please.
Hi, sorry, I'm walking over from the other side of the room. Yeah, so what Olivia has outlined is the reason why we use specifically the words live or chunk in there. We could add the word natural if necessary. We're happy to, but we're just following exactly what ASMFC had put forth for their circle hook provision. So we thought live and chunk kind of covered the fact that it was natural bait.
All right. Can I talk again?
Sure, absolutely.
I am fine when you start using the word live or chunk bait. I think that makes a common sense. We're talking about natural bait or cut bunker or whatever. It's just when you just use the word bait, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that because we'll use the word bait for anything we're using to catch fish with.
Sure, we understand. Appreciate that input for sure. Yeah. There we are.
And that's good. Yeah, I think that's fine.
All right, sir. Thank you. Further comment by members of the commission? All right. This is a public hearing. We'll open it up for public comment. If you wish to comment, hit the chat to the host or...
Phones are unmuted as well.
Phones are unmuted as well. Anyone wishing to comment at this point? Seeing none, that matters. I'm sorry?
Chris Moore, I've got Chris on the line. Hold on just a moment.
All right.
Chris Moore would like to speak.
Dr. Moore?
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner, definitely not Dr. Moore, but obviously the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, no problem. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation has been supporting striped bass conservation for many years. First of all, we'd like to thank the Commission for their efforts long before ASMSC required conservation measurements be put in place to try to kind of get ahead of some of these conservation measures and start the rebound of this iconic fishery. With 70% of the striped bass population basically coming from Chesapeake Bay, it's very important that Virginia do their part. I just wanted to express our support for the circle hook regulations here. There's a lot of work going on to try to reduce recreational discard mortality, and this is one of the things that can help do that. So thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. We appreciate your comment. Anyone else in the public wish to be heard? Phones are unmuted.
The earpiece.
All right, there being none, the matter is before the commission for action and discussion.
James Minor, I move that we approve staff recommendations.
Motion made by Mr. Minor to approve staff recommendations. Is there a second to the motion?
This is Dr.
Yeah, right, one second.
Second by Dr. Neal. Further discussion? I'll call the roll. Mr. France?
Aye.
Thank you. Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mrs. Edrin?
Aye.
Thank you. Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Minor? Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Thank you. Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Olivia, thank you for the presentation. Great job. Next item on the agenda is public hearing pertaining to the licensing requirements and license fees to establish a license fee for the new commercial electrofishing license. Who has this one?
This is Alexa Kretsch today.
Good afternoon, Alexa. You're up.
Good afternoon, Commissioner and members of the Commission. So today is a public hearing on a proposal to amend Chapter 4 VAC 20-1090 pertaining to licensing requirements and license fees to establish a license fee for the new commercial electrofishing license. Next slide, please. In December, the Commission voted to establish Chapter 4 VAC 20-1360 pertaining to commercial electrofishing. This regulation stated that only the approved electroshocker needs this license, and that any helpers on the vessels need a CFRL, a Commercial Fisherman's Registration License, and a fish dip net license. This is because the electrofishing gear does not per se harvest the fish. It is the dip net that harvests the fish that were stunned. So this item was initially approved for a March public hearing in February, but the March Commission meeting was canceled due to COVID-19, so this item was deferred. In the meantime, the season started in May, so a special fishing permit was issued to the eligible licensees to act in lieu of the commercial electrofishing license. And so since they already have this special fishing permit for 2020, if approved, this amendment will go into effect January 1, 2021. Next slide, please. So in 4 VAC 20-1090-30 license fees, under Section 9 Finfish Harvesting Licenses, we have added for each person electrofishing catfish a fee of $100. Subdivision 2 of Section 28.2-201.4 of the Code of Virginia authorizes the Commission to establish new licenses and fees not to exceed $100 for any device used for taking or catching seafood. Next slide. Staff recommends the Commission amend Chapter 4 VAC 20-1090 pertaining to licensing requirements and license fees to establish a license fee for the new commercial electrofishing license. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Alexa. Any questions for Ms. Kretsch by members of the Commission? Okay, this is a public hearing. Does anyone in the public wish to be heard on this matter, for or against? The phone lines are now open and unmuted. Seeing none, the matter is before the commission for action.
Zegers, I move we approve the.
Motion made by Mr. Zegers to approve staff recommendations. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. France. I'll call the roll. Mr. France?
Aye.
Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zegers?
Aye.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. The next item I have on the agenda is a request for an emergency amendment pertaining to Spanish mackerel and king mackerel. Item 15. Who has that?
This is Patrick Gear.
Chief Gear, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Wait for it to come up. There we go. Good afternoon, Commissioner, members of the Commission. This is an emergency amendment to Chapter 4 VAC 20-540-10 pertaining to Spanish mackerel and king mackerel to establish a Spanish mackerel bycatch allowance in state waters once federal waters have closed. Next slide, please. On Friday, July 19th, NOAA Fisheries announced commercial fishing for Spanish mackerel northern zone will close Wednesday, July 22nd. Virginia has nothing in its regulation to complement a federal water closure, nor take advantage of the FMP's allowance of a bycatch allowance in state waters once the federal waters close. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of background about Spanish mackerel management. The Atlantic Migratory Group Spanish mackerel are jointly managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission and the South Atlantic Fisheries Manager Council. For reference, under ASMFC, it falls under the Omnibus Amendment to the Interstate Fisheries Management Plan for Spanish mackerel, spot, and spotted sea trout. It was last updated for Spanish mackerel in August of 2013. For the Council, it falls under the Coastal Migratory Pelagic Resources FMP, and it was last updated in Framework Amendment 1 in May of 2014. The Coast Guard annual commercial catch limit is 3.3 million pounds and is broken into two management zones, the southern and the northern zone. Virginia is in the northern zone and has a commercial annual catch limit of 662,670 pounds. The season runs from March 1st until the last day of February or until the quota is met. Virginia's regulations follow the FMP maximum daily commercial catch limit of 3,500 pounds per vessel. The FMP also allows for that daily 500-pound per vessel bycatch allowance in state waters once waters close. The stock is not overfished, and overfishing could not be determined in the last stock assessment, which was completed in 2012. Next slide, please. Okay. This is a slide of the Northern Zone commercial landings since 2015, showing the last 6 seasons. And as I mentioned, March 1st to February of the next year. The data for the present 2020-21 season is through July 20th and indicates 101.9% of the quota has been harvested. NOAA just updated these numbers late yesterday afternoon, and the landings are now at 103.4% of the quota. The quota has been exceeded each of the past 4 years, and the season is closing earlier each year, as indicated by the dates above each bar. Next slide. These are the landings by state for the northern zone only. North Carolina is shown in blue, typically accounts for 90% of the overall landings, with Virginia shown in green, accounting for about 7% of the annual landings. Virginia had a large increase in landings in 2019, making up about 14.6% of the reported northern zone landings in 2019. Next slide, please. And this is showing the same information for Virginia alone. The 3-year average between 2016 to 2019 was just under 28,000 pounds, but landings in 2019 were 5 times that at 136,000 pounds. Over the past 5 years, 80% of the landings are coming from pound nets, with 18.5% from gill nets. However, most of the effort is associated with gill nets as incidental catch. Next slide, please. This is Virginia landings by month average over the last 5 years. June and July are typically the peak months for landings, but in 2019, August had similar high landings as well. The federal water closures that we saw in November of 2017 and 18 would have had very little impact on Virginia harvest, since fish have already moved out of the bay. However, in 2019, 11% of the harvest and 38% of the trips occurred after the federal waters closed on August 4th, with only 4 of those trips over 500 pounds or more. The average reported catch per trip in state waters after the federal waters closed in 2019 was just under 29 pounds per trip, compared to 100 pounds per trip for the entire season. Given the low catch rates in August, allowing a reduced bycatch fishery to continue after federal waters close will not have much of an impact, but will allow fishermen to take advantage of these fish when incidentally caught, and will also reduce regulatory discards. Next slide, please. Okay, you've seen this a dozen times already. There's ongoing tasks of cleaning up regulations when we open them. So regulatory changes are shown in yellow, and language changes are shown in brown. The next slide, please. This is section 30 of chapter 4 VAC 20-540. It relates to possession limits. So on page 1 of your regulation, we added the word recreational to the title and deleted established, because the section has already been established in the past. Subsection A, we reworked it to be consistent with other regulations, term hook and line, and we deleted the entire subsection C, since this section 30 now addresses only recreational possession limits. Next slide, please. Section 40 deals with minimum size limits, and it's on page 2 of your regulation. Again, we removed established because it's already been done in the past, and added some clarifying language in subsections A and E. Next slide, please. Section 50 is the main purpose for this emergency amendment. It appears on page 2 of the regulation that addresses trip limits. In the title, we added the word commercial, and once again, we removed established. The first statement was previously a standalone section in this section, but now it is subsection A, with an exception for the new section, subsection B. Subsection B is new and establishes the bycatch allowance and reads as, when a commercial closure in federal waters for the Northern Zone Atlantic Migratory Group Spanish mackerel is announced by the National Marine Fisheries Service, it shall be unlawful for any person to possess or land in Virginia any amount of Spanish mackerel in excess of 500 pounds from any vessel in any one day. This federal closure and state water per trip possession limit will be posted on the Commission's website. Next slide, please. And staff, there you go. Staff recommends to the Commission to amend Chapter 4 VAC 20-540-10 pertaining to Spanish mackerel and king mackerel to establish a 500-pound daily per vessel bycatch provision in state waters for the Spanish mackerel commercial fishery to coincide with federal waters closures as announced by the National Marine Fisheries Service. Staff also recommends advertising for a public hearing for the August Commission meeting to make these amendments a permanent part of regulation. And if this amendment is approved, we plan on the implementation date of Monday, August 3rd, which gives some time to notify fishermen and buyers about this change. And I'll take any questions at this time.
Any questions for Chief of Fisheries Gear by members of the Commission? There being none, this is a public hearing. Anyone in the public wishes to be heard, please either indicate by the chat icon on your computer or now when the phone lines are unmuted and open. State your name. There being none, the matter is before the Commission.
Mr. France moves to accept staff recommendations.
Motion made by Mr. France to approve staff recommendation. Is there a second to the motion?
Christy Everett, second.
Ms. Everett seconds the motion. Mr. France?
Aye.
Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin?
Aye.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Is there any more business to come before the commission before I just say a few words before we adjourn? I would certainly appreciate if a motion be made to adjourn in honor of a longstanding employee, Hank Badger, who will be retiring August the 1st of 2020. Ben Stagg was kind enough to write a short paragraph, and I'd like to read it into the record. And Ben says, I wanted to say a little more about Hank and his family's history with the agency. Hank's grandfather was associated with the Commission of Fisheries, precursor to VMRC, beginning in 1907. He eventually became the chief engineer for the Engineering Survey Division before his eventual retirement. Hank's father also worked for the commission starting in the 1940s, and he also became chief engineer in 1950 and served until his death at age 51 in 1968. Hank started with the agency in 1978, and he too eventually became chief engineer, except for a brief period of time between 1968 and 1978. There has been a Badger working for the agency since 1907. Hank's retirement marks the end of an era that will likely not be seen again with this agency. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Hank for his long-term service to the Marine Resources Commission, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Not only was he a very, very valued employee, he was a wonderful friend, and we certainly will miss him, and we wish him the very, very best and a deserved retirement and second life to be had to enjoy. Chair will entertain a motion.
I move we adjourn. Zedrin.
Motion made by Mr. Zedrin to adjourn. Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Second made by Mr. Minor. All in favor of adjourning in honor of the long-standing service of Mr. Badger, say aye.
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 All opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, everyone, for their time and effort today. Much appreciated as we work through these difficult times. Look forward to seeing you again in person. God bless and stay safe. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.